This dude got exploded into charcoal at 13, woke up a walking apocalypse with Doomsday-level bullshit, and now he's out here yeeting villains through ceilings while bone armor grows mid-fight. Deku snaps necks, flies, glows like a pissed-off god, and makes Shigaraki piss himself before handling his ass. This man is the definition of can't kill the vibe.
Welcome, legends, to Chronos Recom. I wrote this story myself, so if you have any suggestions or what-ifs you want to see, drop it in the comments below. Also, just wanted to let you know I've got a Patreon set up now for anyone who wants to support the channel directly. You can get early access to stories, submit direct fan requests, and get exclusive content. It's totally optional, but if you want to help keep these stories coming, check it out. Links in the description. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit that bell so you never miss an upload. Let's dive into this story.
The factory smelled like rust and old chemicals. Izuku Midoriya knew this place. Every kid in the neighborhood knew it. The abandoned Musutafu industrial complex on the edge of the river district, where the pipes still leaked something green into the soil and the walls sagged under years of neglect. He had been dragged here before, pushed against the walls, hit where teachers wouldn't see the marks. But tonight was different. He could feel it in the way Katsuki Bakugo's hands trembled, the way his palms crackled with sparks that came too fast, too bright. The way three other boys stood behind him with their mouths set in thin, nervous lines, following because they always followed, because stopping meant becoming the next target. Izuku stood with it against a row of rusted chemical drums. The labels had long since peeled away, but the faded hazard symbols told enough of a story. His school uniform was torn at the collar from being grabbed. His lip was split from the first hit outside the gates. "You think you can just keep showing up?" Bakugo said. His voice was too loud for the enclosed space. The factory walls bounced it back in distorted echoes. "You think you can just exist near me, and it's fine? You're nothing. You're less than nothing. You don't have a quirk. You don't have a future. And you keep looking at me like..." He didn't finish. He brought both hands together and the explosion was enormous. It wasn't aimed at Izuku's face or his chest. It hit the drum behind him. The first one ignited. The chemical inside, something petroleum-based, something that should have been disposed of a decade ago, erupted in a pillar of fire that hit the ceiling and spread. The second drum went. Then the third. Then 7 more in a chain reaction that turned the entire eastern wall of the factory into a rolling wave of orange and white flame. Bakugo and his group ran. They made it to the loading dock entrance and threw themselves out into the night air, coughing, their uniforms singed but their bodies intact. Behind them, the factory became an inferno. Izuku did not make it out. The fire took him in stages. The initial blast threw him sideways into the wall. The impact cracked 3 of his ribs' left wrist. Then the heat came, a wall of it, so intense that his skin blistered before the flames even touched him. When the fire reached him, it peeled the flesh from his arms in sheets. His school uniform disintegrated, his hair caught and burned to nothing. He opened his mouth to scream, and the superheated air rushed in and cooked his lungs from the inside. He fell. His body convulsed once, twice, then went rigid. The fat under his skin liquefied. His muscles contracted and tore themselves apart. His bones blackened. His heart, the last thing still functioning in a body that had already ceased to be recognizable as human, beat 4 more times. Each beat was weaker. The 5th beat never came. Izuku Midoriya died at 13 years old on a factory floor in Musutafu, surrounded by chemical fire, with his skeleton charring to powder and the person who killed him already 3 blocks away and still running. The silence lasted 10 minutes. Then something moved in the ash. It started with a sound, wet and violent, like meat being torn in reverse. The charred skeleton at the center of the burn site cracked along every major joint. New material pushed outward from inside the bones. White. Dense. Harder than what had been there before. Tendons snapped back into existence, threading themselves through the reforming skeleton with a speed that belonged in a nightmare. Muscles wove over the frame like fabric being pulled tight across a drum. Skin crawled over the surface, but it was wrong. It was pale, thicker than normal. slightly off in texture, like scar tissue layered 100 times over. And then the bones came. White protrusions punched through the new skin at the knuckles, along the forearms, across the tops of his shoulders, down his spine, along his jaw and cheekbones, subtle ridges of dense calcified growth that sat just beneath the surface and gave his face a structure that hadn't been there before. His body was larger, his frame was wider, the proportions of a 13-year-old boy had been replaced by something closer to a young predator's build. His eyes opened. They were the same green they had always been, but the sclera was threaded with veins of dull red that pulsed once with the first heartbeat of his new life. He gasped. His hands slammed the concrete floor and the impact cracked it in a starburst pattern 2 meters wide. He rolled onto his side, naked and steaming in the remnants of the fire, and the flames licked at his skin and did nothing. He felt them. They were warm. That was all. The fire that had killed him couldn't even make him flinch anymore. He lay there for a long time, breathing, feeling his new body settle into itself. The weight of it, the density of it, the way his heartbeat sounded different, slower and heavier, as though his heart had been rebuilt with walls twice as thick. He held his hand up in front of his face. The knuckles were armored with bony ridges. Each finger was slightly thicker than before. When he made a fist, the bones along his forearm shifted and clicked into a tighter formation, like plates of natural armor locking together. He understood what had happened. He had a quirk. It had been dormant. It had been waiting. And it had needed death to wake up. Izuku stood. The factory groaned around him, the walls sagging inward, the roof beginning to buckle. He turned toward the loading dock entrance. It was blocked by a collapsed steel beam and a twisted security door. He punched it. The steel door flew off its frame and skipped across the parking lot like a stone on water, carving a trench through the asphalt before embedding itself in a chain-link fence 40 meters away. He stepped out into the night. The air was cold on his bare, pale skin. The bone ridges along his shoulders steamed faintly. Behind him, the factory caved in on itself with a groan of twisted metal. Izuku Midoriya walked home barefoot, wearing nothing but ash, and somewhere between the factory and his mother's front door, the tears came. Because he was alive. Because he had died. Because the person who killed him was someone he had once called a friend. And now, he was something that could never be killed like that again. The grief and the power lived in him together, tangled around each other like roots in soil, and he knew already that they would never separate. His mother screamed when she saw him. Then she held him. The bone spikes along his spine pressed against her arms, and she held him anyway, crying harder than he had ever heard her cry, and he was careful, so careful with how he held her back. Because his hands could break concrete now. Because his fingers could crush steel. Because the boy she had raised was still in there somewhere. But the body he wore was built for war. He spent the next year learning what he was. The fire immunity was absolute. He tested it with his mother's stove first, then with a blowtorch he bought from a hardware store. The flame touched his skin and his nerves registered warmth but refused to register pain. His cellular structure had been rewritten at the moment of death. The factory fire had become information, and his body had encoded the solution into every cell. Whatever killed him once could never kill him again. His strength grew with his body. At 14, he could crush a cinder block in one hand without effort. He could leap from the ground to a 4-story rooftop in a single bound. He could run at speeds that blurred his form. His stamina seemed infinite. He ran for 9 hours one night just to test it, and when he stopped, his heart rate was barely elevated. The bone growth stabilized over time. The protrusions at his knuckles, forearms, and shoulders became permanent features. White, dense, slightly warm to the touch. When he was calm, they sat flush against his body, visible but contained. When his adrenaline spiked, they extended, pushing outward, sharpening, armoring him in a visible display of escalation. His jaw ridges gave his face a severe, angular look. His cheekbones carried subtle lines of bone growth that made him look older, harder. His eyes retained the red threading in the sclera permanently. His voice dropped, the result of his throat and vocal cords being rebuilt denser during the resurrection, and at 14 he sounded like a man in his 20s. A low rasp that carried weight even when he was saying something ordinary. He hid it as best he could. Baggy clothes, hoodies with high collars, gloves in the winter. He wore his school uniform with the sleeves pulled down and the collar buttoned all the way up. The bone ridges on his face he couldn't hide, but he let people assume they were a cosmetic quirk, something minor and useless. He told no one what actually happened at the factory. His mother knew he had a quirk now, she could see it, but he never told her he had died to get it. He let her believe it had simply manifested late. The alternative would have broken her in ways that his new body couldn't fix. He applied to UA at 15. The morning of the entrance exam, he stood in front of his mirror and pulled on a gray tracksuit. The fabric was thick enough to hide the forearm protrusions and loose enough to conceal the shoulder spikes. He looked almost normal if you didn't look too closely. The jaw ridges were visible. The thick, scarred texture of his skin was visible. His eyes gave people pause, but he could pass for a kid with a minor physical mutation quirk, and that was enough. He walked to UA with his mother's lunch in his bag, and the knowledge that he had died once rebuilt himself from a skeleton and could never be killed the same way again. The gates were enormous. The campus was sprawling. Hundreds of examinees milled around him, nervous, excited, radiating the kind of anxious energy that filled the air before a competition. A girl with brown hair tripped near the entrance, and a boy with engines in his calves caught her. A tall student with multiple arms stretched in the courtyard. Somewhere behind him, Izuku heard a familiar crackling sound, Bakugo's palms sparking as he walked through the gates without looking at anyone. Izuku kept his head forward and his hands in his pockets. He felt the weight of what he was pressing against the inside of his tracksuit, the bone ridges shifting slightly as his body responded to the ambient adrenaline. He breathed. He walked in. Present Mike explained the rules from a stage in the auditorium. Point system. Robots. Destroy them for points. 1-pointers, 2-pointers, 3-pointers. And the 0-pointer, a massive trap designed to be avoided, worth nothing. Run from it. Present Mike said. It can't be defeated. Izuku listened. He sat in the back row with his arms crossed and his collar up, and he took in the information with the focus of someone who had spent a year training alone, pushing his own limits, preparing for exactly this. He did not look for Bakugo in the crowd. That chapter was closed in a way that Bakugo himself didn't understand yet. They bussed the examinees to the testing grounds. Izuku was assigned to Zone B. The cityscape was artificial, a full mock-up of an urban environment, complete with streets, intersections, and buildings that reached 6 stories tall. The robots waited inside. When the buzzer sounded, the other examinees charged forward. Izuku walked. He moved through the streets at an even pace, hands still in his pockets. A 1-pointer rolled out from a side alley, a tank-treaded machine with a rotating turret. It fired a rubber projectile at his chest. The impact hit his sternum and felt like a firm poke. He grabbed the robot by its turret, lifted the entire 3-ton machine over his head with one arm and threw it into the building across the street. It exploded on impact. 1 point. He kept walking. 3 more came around a corner. 2-pointers moving fast on wheeled legs. Izuku pulled his right hand from his pocket and punched the first one. His fist went through the chassis and out the other side. He ripped his arm free, swung the robot's torn body into the second one, and stomped the third flat with a single downward strike of his foot. The asphalt cracked beneath the robot's crushed frame. 6 points. The noise attracted more. A group of 8 converged on him, a mix of all 3-point values moving in a coordinated formation. Izuku cracked his neck. The bone ridges along his shoulders extended slightly, his body reading the increase in threat and responding by armoring up. He tore through them in 11 seconds. 13 robots destroyed by the time he reached the first major intersection. 26 points. And then the missiles came. A 3-pointer he hadn't seen, positioned on a rooftop, launched a pair of shoulder-mounted explosive rounds at a cluster of examinees near the intersection. One of those examinees was a tall girl with a black ponytail. She had created a metal shield from her arm. Her quirk was creation. Izuku recognized it instantly, but the missile was too fast and the angle was wrong. It was going to hit her. Izuku moved. He crossed 30 meters in under 2 seconds, a flat sprint that left cracks in the pavement behind him. He stepped in front of the missile. It hit his ribs. The The explosion cracked 3 of them inward and threw him backward into a car. The car crumpled around his body. Pain shot through his torso like lightning. Real pain, sharp and immediate and white-hot. He lay in the wreckage for exactly 5 seconds. In those 5 seconds, the broken ribs reset with audible pops. The skin over his sternum thickened. Dense bone plating slid into position beneath it, a new layer of armor his body hadn't possessed 5 seconds earlier. His cellular structure encoded the information. Kinetic explosive yield at this level is a solved problem. His chest was now reinforced against missile impacts. He stood up. The crumpled car fell away from him. He rolled his shoulders. The bone plating on his chest was visible through his torn tracksuit, white, ridged, covering his sternum and the lower portion of his rib cage. He looked down at it, flexed once to ensure mobility was unaffected, and turned back toward the robots. He tore the rest apart with his bare hands. He ripped open a 3-pointer's torso like he was peeling an orange. He drove his fist through the center mass of a 2-pointer and used the robot's own body as a bludgeon against the next 3 in line. He moved through the artificial city like a natural disaster, unstoppable, unslowing, the ground cracking beneath his feet with every step that carried more force than the pavement was designed to handle. When the 0-pointer emerged, the earth shook. It was enormous. A building-sized machine on treads the width of a highway, its head scraping the top of the 6-story structures on either side of the main street. Its shadow swallowed the intersection. Examinees ran. The protocol was clear. Run from it. It was worth nothing. It couldn't be beaten. Izuku saw the girl with the black ponytail. She was on the ground. Her leg was pinned beneath a chunk of concrete that had fallen from a building the 0-pointer had clipped. She was pulling at it, strong enough to lift heavy objects with equipment she created, but trapped at an angle where leverage meant nothing. The 0-pointer's foot was coming down. Izuku ran at it. The ground splintered behind him. Each stride covered 5 meters. The wind displaced by his movement pushed debris outward in his wake. He reached the 0-pointer's leg, a pillar of steel and industrial machinery the size of a redwood, and jumped. His thighs coiled and released with a force that launched him 60 meters into the air. He pulled back his right fist. The bone ridges along his knuckles extended, locking into position. He threw the punch untrained, wild with everything his body could generate. His fist connected with the 0-pointer's knee joint. The impact sounded like a bomb. The steel buckled. The joint collapsed inward. The 0-pointer's leg gave out, the entire machine tilting sideways with a groan that shook the testing ground. It fell in slow motion. Izuku was already falling faster. He hit the ground in a 3-point landing that cratered the asphalt around him, then turned and sprinted to the girl. The concrete pinning her leg, he grabbed it with one hand and tossed it aside like it weighed nothing. He scooped her up. The 0-pointer was falling toward them. Izuku turned his body to shield her, his back to the impact, his bone-spiked arm angled over her head, his frame curled around hers. The debris hit him. Steel fragments, concrete chunks. Shrapnel from the robot's disintegrating leg. Each impact struck his back and shoulders, and he felt them, and they registered as nothing. The bone armor along his spine took the punishment without cracking. The dust settled. He straightened. He looked down at the girl in his arms. Dark hair, gray eyes wide with something that wasn't fear. She was staring at the arm protecting her, at the white bone ridges along his forearm, the armored knuckles, the thick scarred skin that didn't belong on any 15-year-old. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice was low, soft, the rasp of it gentled by genuine concern. She looked up at his face, at the bone ridges along his jaw, the red threading in his eyes, the structure of something inhuman wearing a boy's expression. She blinked once. "Yes," she said. Then, "Your arm, does the bone growth respond to specific threat stimuli, or is it a generalized stress response?" He stared at her. In all his life, no one had ever responded to seeing his body with a question like that. Fear, yes. Disgust, sometimes. Pity, often. A request for biological data? Never. He set her down carefully. She tested her leg, bruised but functional, and stood on her own. The dust from the fallen 0-pointer drifted around them. Other examinees were staring from a distance. Nobody approached. "It responds to threat," he said. "Specific threat. If something hurts me, the area reinforces itself against that specific type of damage." Her eyes lit up. Reactive adaptation at the cellular level. That's extraordinary. The metabolic energy requirements must be... She caught herself, smoothed her expression, extended her hand. Momo Yaoyorozu, thank you for saving me. He took her hand. His grip was feather-light. He was always careful. Izuku Midoriya. Midoriya, she repeated, looking at where his hand enveloped hers. Like, I'd like to learn more about your quirk, if you'd allow it. I think there are applications you haven't explored. He almost smiled. Almost. I haven't explored much of anything yet. Then we have a lot of work to do, she said. The buzzer sounded. The exam was over. Izuku had 78 villain points and an additional number of rescue points he wouldn't learn about until the results arrived. He walked out of the testing zone with his tracksuit hanging in tatters, the bone armor on his chest visible to every examinee who looked his way, and the memory of a girl who touched the monster and asked how it worked. The acceptance letter came with a holographic projection of All Might. Izuku watched it on his desk in his bedroom, the number 1 hero's beaming face filling the room with golden light. He'd gotten in. First place in the practical exam. The rescue points had pushed him over the top, but the villain points alone would have secured his spot. His mother cried. She always cried. He held her and felt her hands press against the bone ridges on his back, and he told her everything would be fine. He meant it. For the first time in his life, he had somewhere to go and the power to belong there. The first day at UA hit different. Class 1A was 20 students with the kind of quirks that had cleared elite entrance exams. Izuku walked in wearing his uniform buttoned to the top, his hands in his pockets, and every head turned. The bone ridges along his jaw caught the fluorescent light. His eyes held that faint red threading. His frame, too large, too dense for a 15-year-old, filled the doorway in a way that made the room feel smaller. He felt them all looking. He found his assigned seat and sat down without acknowledging it. The chair creaked under his weight. Aizawa Shota, their homeroom teacher, the underground hero Eraserhead, stood at the front with his sleeping bag pooled around his ankles and his capture weapon hanging loose. He looked at the class roster, then at Izuku, then back at the roster, and something in his expression shifted. He'd read the file. He knew what he was looking at. Quirk assessment test, Aizawa said. Today. Outside. Now. Standard fitness tests. Ball throw, standing long jump, 50-meter dash, grip strength, repeated side steps, upper body training, seated toe touch, endurance run. Whoever finishes last gets expelled. The class filtered out to the training field. The morning air was cool. 20 students stood in a loose semicircle and waited for instructions. Aizawa handed Bakugo a softball. Throw it. Use your quirk. Bakugo stepped into the circle, his palms crackled. He wound up and hurled the ball with a detonation that sent it screaming into the distance. 705 meters. The class murmured in appreciation. Aizawa's eyes slid to Izuku. Midoriya, you're next. Izuku stepped forward. He took the ball. It felt like nothing in his hand, a weightless sphere against fingers that could bend rebar. He didn't wind up. He just threw. No quirk activation needed. His raw physical strength was the quirk. The ball vanished. It crossed the testing field, cleared the tree line, and kept going until the tracker stopped registering. Aizawa looked down at the device. The number on the screen was 2.1 kilometers. The class went silent. That's not possible with a throw, someone said behind him. His arm didn't even look like it was trying, another voice whispered. Aizawa watched Izuku walk back to the group. His expression was unreadable. Then he activated his quirk. His hair rose, his eyes flared red. The erasure targeted Izuku. Nothing happened. Izuku blinked. He felt something brush against him, like a breeze that meant to be a wall. But his body was unchanged. His strength was unchanged. The bone ridges on his forearms were still there, still dense, still warm. He looked at Aizawa. It didn't work, Izuku said. Aizawa stared at him. His erasure was active. His eyes were burning with it. And the boy in front of him stood completely unaffected. Your quirk has no activation state, Aizawa said. It was a statement. It's always on, Izuku confirmed. It's written into my cells. There's nothing to turn off. Aizawa let his quirk drop. His hair fell. He stared at Izuku for 3 more seconds, then wrote something on his clipboard and moved on. The rest of the fitness tests were a formality. Izuku broke every metric without straining. Grip strength. The machine broke before it could measure him. 50-meter dash, 1.2 seconds. Standing long jump, he overshot the sandbox by 80 meters and landed on the running track. Seated toe touch, the only test that measured flexibility, and his bone protrusions made it slightly awkward, so he scored average. Repeated side steps, the ground cracked from the lateral force. He finished first in every category that mattered. The class watched him with a spectrum of emotions: awe, envy, fascination, unease. He sat back down on the grass after his endurance run and waited for everyone else to finish, and the students near him maintained a radius of about 3 meters. They didn't crowd him. Something about his presence made casual proximity feel wrong, like standing too close to a transformer box humming with voltage. One person crossed that radius. Momo Yaoyorozu sat down beside him on the grass, her ponytail swaying as she settled. "Your output hasn't dropped at all," she said, like they were in the middle of a conversation that had been ongoing for hours. "Most strength-based quirks fatigue over repetition. You've maintained the same force ceiling across every test." "I don't get tired," he said. "At all?" "At all." She pulled a small notebook from the pocket of her gym uniform. "May I?" He nodded. She began writing, noting his test results, his response times, the way his bone armor shifted when he exerted force versus when he was at rest. Her handwriting was precise and quick. "You're the girl from the exam," he said, "and you're the boy who punched through a zero-pointer and asked if I was all right while looking like something from a mythology textbook." She glanced up. Her eyes held warmth. "I remember." He was quiet. Then, "Thank you for being here." Where else would I be? The combat training came in the afternoon. All Might himself taught the class, his titanic frame barely fitting through the door of Training Ground Beta. The exercise was simple. Teams of 2, one attacking, one defending, a mock bomb in a building. Heroes versus villains. Random pairings. The lottery paired Izuku with a boy named Ojiro, a martial artist with a powerful tail. Their opponents were Bakugo and a boy named Ida, whose engine calves gave him tremendous speed. When the matchup was announced, the air in the monitoring room changed. The other students felt it. They saw Bakugo's face. Katsuki Bakugo had recognized Izuku the moment he walked into Class 1A. The bone ridges, the voice, the eyes. The impossible presence of a boy who should have been ash in an abandoned factory. Bakugo hadn't slept well in 2 years. He had nightmares about that night, the explosion, the fire, the screaming that stopped. He had never told anyone. He had lived with it like a stone in his chest, pressing on everything, making every breath taste slightly wrong. And now Izuku was here, alive, different, monstrous, more powerful than anything Bakugo had ever seen. The exercise started. Izuku told Ojiro to go for the bomb. Ojiro hesitated, looking at Izuku's face, at the certainty in those red-threaded eyes, then nodded and took the back staircase. Izuku walked in through the front door. He walked through the hallway like he owned it. His footsteps echoed. The floor trembled under his weight. Bakugo was waiting on the 3rd floor. His gauntlets were primed, the specialized support gear designed to store his sweat and release it in concentrated blasts. His hands were shaking. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. "You're dead," Bakugo said. His voice cracked. "You were dead. I saw it. I saw." "I came back," Izuku said. Bakugo screamed and fired. Both gauntlets. Maximum output. The hallway became a tunnel of fire and concussive force, an explosion that would have leveled a small building, concentrated into a space 6 meters wide. The walls blew outward, the ceiling caved. Smoke and flame and debris filled every inch of the corridor. Izuku walked through it. His tracksuit burned away in patches. The fire rolled across his skin, and his body didn't react because fire was solved. It was history. The concussive force hit his chest, and the bone plating absorbed it, and his feet kept moving. He emerged from the wall of flame with his uniform smoldering, his bone protrusions glowing faintly from heat absorption, and his eyes locked on Bakugo with an expression that held something worse than anger. It held certainty. Bakugo fired again, point blank, both palms against Izuku's chest. The explosion was enormous. The force of it would have ruptured a normal person's organs. Izuku felt the heat. He felt the push. He moved backward 2 inches. His hand came up. Those armored fingers closed around the collar of Bakugo's costume. He lifted him off the ground with one arm, Bakugo's feet dangling, his palms still sparking uselessly against Izuku's forearm, the explosions dissipating against bone armor without effect. Izuku pinned him to the wall. His grip was iron. His face was close. The bone ridges along his jaw caught the emergency lighting. "You can't burn me anymore," he said. The words hit the monitoring room like a shockwave. 18 students stood frozen in front of the screens. All Might's smile faltered. The silence was absolute. Bakugo hung there. His palms sparked. His eyes were wide, wider than anyone had ever seen them. And what lived behind those eyes was a recognition so complete that it left room for nothing else. The boy he had killed. Alive. Immune to everything Bakugo could throw. Holding him against a wall with casual, insurmountable strength, Izuku held him there. 3 seconds, 4, 5, long enough for the message to carve itself into Bakugo's memory permanently. Then he opened his hand. Bakugo dropped to the floor, his legs buckled. He didn't get back up. Izuku walked past him toward the bomb room. He placed his hand on the weapon casing, and the exercise ended. In the monitoring room, Kirishima let out a breath he'd been holding for 30 seconds. What the hell was that? Nobody answered. The days at UA fell into rhythm after that. Classes, training, hero studies. Izuku attended them all with the same steady, heavy presence, sitting in his seat like a monument, his weight making the chair groan, his bone-ridged knuckles resting on the desk. Teachers adapted. They stopped calling on him to demonstrate restraint exercises because the concept meant something different for him. They stopped pairing him against single opponents because the outcomes were predetermined. Momo found him during lunch on the 4th day. She slid into the seat across from him in the cafeteria with a tray of food and a tablet full of research. "I've been thinking about your adaptation threshold," she said without preamble. "There has to be a minimum stimulus required to trigger a permanent cellular change versus a temporary reinforcement. When the missile hit you during the exam, your chest plating developed within seconds. But the softball throw during Aizawa's test didn't trigger any skeletal response at all. So there's a pain threshold, or possibly a damage threshold, below which your body doesn't bother adapting because it doesn't register the event as a genuine survival threat." Izuku looked at her. She was eating rice with one hand and scrolling through cellular biology papers with the other, and she was talking to him like he was a fascinating machine rather than a monster. He felt something in his chest that had nothing to do with bone plating. "You're right," he said. "It has to actually hurt me, something that can harm me enough to threaten my survival. Otherwise, my body just tanks it and moves on." "Which means your adaptation is an immune response scaled up to the whole body level," she said. "Your quirk treats specific types of damage the way a normal immune system treats a pathogen. Exposure triggers a permanent defense. But instead of antibodies, you grow bone armor and heat resistance and enhanced durability at the exact site and type of injury." "That's a better explanation than anything I've come up with." She looked up from her tablet. Her expression softened. "How much does it hurt? The adaptation. When something hits you hard enough to trigger it." He was quiet for a moment. "A lot. It hurts a lot. And the rebuilding hurts more." She didn't flinch. She didn't offer pity. She reached across the table and touched the bone growth along his forearm, ran her fingertips along the ridge with the curiosity of a scientist and the gentleness of someone who understood what those ridges represented. "Every one of these is proof that something tried to break you and failed," she said. He looked at her hand on his arm. "Most people think they make me look like a monster. They make you look like a survivor," she said. Then she touched the bone ridge along his jaw, the subtle growth that gave his face its angular, inhuman severity. Her fingers were warm against the dense, calcified surface. "It's the proof that you survived. That's remarkable." He had no response. He sat there in the UA cafeteria with this brilliant, composed, entirely fearless girl, touching the thing that made everyone else keep their distance. And he realized that he had been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like when someone reached toward him instead of pulling away. Their training sessions began the next week. Momo created tungsten weights, dense cylinders that she produced from the lipids in her body and presented to him in sets of increasing mass. "For controlled output," she explained, "you need to learn the difference between a punch that disables and a punch that kills. These will help you calibrate." She made him targets with varying structural integrity. Some designed to break at specific force thresholds, some meant to withstand everything he could throw. She stood at the edge of the training field with a clipboard and timed his adaptation responses, measured the density of new bone growth, recorded how quickly his healing factor closed wounds of different severities. "You're treating me like a research project," he said one afternoon, after she'd spent 20 minutes measuring the conductivity of his bone protrusions. "I'm treating you like a person whose power deserves to be understood," she corrected. "There's a difference." She paused. "Also, you're the most fascinating organism I've ever encountered, and I refuse to apologize for my scientific curiosity." He laughed. It was a rare sound, low and genuine and surprised out of him, and Momo looked up sharply when she heard it. Something flickered across her face. Interest. Warmth. The beginning of something she filed away for later examination. Their dynamic evolved. She would create equipment, reinforced gauntlets to focus his strikes, weighted training harnesses, impact-absorbing pads that let classmates spar with him without getting hospitalized. He would tell her what he'd discovered about his body's responses, what new things he'd become immune to, what still hurt, what he was afraid of testing. "You haven't tested everything," she said one evening as they sat on the steps outside Gym Gamma. The sun was setting and the campus was gold and orange and empty. "Testing means getting hurt," he said. "Sometimes testing means dying." "You've died before." She said it without flinching. "Once. When I was 13. What was it like?" He looked at the sunset. The bone ridges on his shoulders cast long shadows on the steps behind him. "It was the worst thing that ever happened to me. And then waking up was the second worst thing, because I was alone and I was different, and everything I'd been before was gone." She was quiet. Then she moved closer on the step, close enough that her shoulder pressed against his arm, the fabric of her jacket against the dense, scarred skin. She didn't say anything comforting or hollow. She just sat with him in the knowledge of what he'd survived and what it had cost him. It was the most intimate thing anyone had ever done for him. The USJ attack came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into the semester. Class 1A was bussed to the unforeseen simulation joint, a massive training facility with multiple environment zones designed to simulate rescue scenarios. 13, the space hero, led the introduction. Aizawa stood guard at the perimeter. Everything was proceeding normally. Then the portal opened. It materialized at the center of the facility's main plaza, a swirling vortex of black and purple fog that expanded until it was 20 meters wide. Figures stepped through, dozens of them, villains, low-tier thugs with combat quirks and wild eyes moving in a swarm. Behind them, a figure made of fog held the portal stable. And at the front, slouching forward with his hands in his pockets and a severed hand covering his face, was a young man with pale blue hair and red eyes visible between the hand's fingers, Tamura Shigaraki, the leader. Beside him stood something that made the student's blood run cold. The Nomu was massive, 7 feet tall with an exposed brain, pitch-black skin, and a musculature that looked engineered rather than grown. Its eyes were blank. Its mouth was a perpetual flat line. It radiated the energy of something built to kill and nothing else. Aizawa moved first. He dropped into the villain mob with his capture weapon flying, taking down 3, 4, 5 in rapid succession. But the numbers were wrong. Too many. And Shigaraki wasn't watching Aizawa. He was looking at the students. "Kill the children," Shigaraki said. His voice was a scratch. "Let the Nomu handle any heroes." Izuku was already moving. He stepped in front of the class. All 20 of them behind his back. His tracksuit stretched across his shoulders as the bone protrusions extended, his body reading the threat level and armoring up in real time. The ridges along his forearms locked into plated formation, his jaw ridges sharpened. His eyes burned with that dull red glow. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice carried without volume. "All of you." The low-tier villains charged. Izuku met them head-on. He hit the first one with an open palm that sent the man flying 30 meters backward into a fountain. The second swung a metal pipe at his head. It bent around his skull, and the villain's wrist broke from the recoil. Izuku grabbed the third by the ankle and used him as a bludgeon against the fourth and fifth. He moved through them like they were training dummies, arms swinging, body plowing forward, each step accompanied by the crack of impact and the sound of bodies hitting concrete. 12 went down in 8 seconds. The Nomu moved. It was fast. Faster than something that large should have been. It covered the distance between Shigaraki and Izuku in a heartbeat, and its fist connected with Izuku's face with a force that would have cratered a building's foundation. Izuku flew backward. He hit the ground and carved a trench through the plaza tiles. His jaw was dislocated. His cheekbone was fractured. Pain lit up the left side of his face like a flare. He reset his jaw with one hand, a wet pop, and stood. The Nomu was already on him again. A punch to the chest. The bone armor cracked. A kick that launched him into a pillar. The pillar collapsed around him. The Nomu had shock absorption. Izuku could feel it. Every hit he landed was dampened. The kinetic energy eaten by the creature's quirk before it could deal full damage. And the Nomu had super regeneration. Damage Izuku did manage to inflict healed in moments. They were locked in a war of attrition that the Nomu's designers had calibrated to win. Izuku planted his feet and threw a punch with everything he had. The Nomu's shock absorption ate it. The creature didn't move. It grabbed Izuku's extended arm and twisted. The bone broke. Izuku felt the snap, felt his forearm separate at the midpoint, felt the grinding of bone on bone. He hit the Nomu with his other hand, again. Each blow absorbed, each impact nullified. The Nomu hit back, a straight right into Izuku's solar plexus that would have killed any normal person. Izuku's internal organs bruised, his diaphragm spasmed. Blood came up his throat. The Nomu grabbed his head with both hands. Those blank eyes stared into his. The twist was instant. Izuku's neck snapped with a sound that carried across the entire facility. He collapsed. His body went limp. His eyes were open and empty. He hit the ground face first and didn't move. The facility went silent. Momo screamed. It was a sound that came from somewhere deeper than her lungs, a raw, tearing noise that cut through the chaos and made everyone stop. She was on her knees behind the barricade Ida had formed, her hands over her mouth, her eyes locked on the body of the boy who had saved her. Shigaraki tilted his head. That's disappointing. I thought the strong one would last longer. Bakugo stood rigid behind the student line. His face was white. He had seen this before. He had seen Izuku Midoriya dead once already, burning in a factory, going still, going silent. The memory crashed into the present, and for a horrible moment he was 13 again, running into the night with murder on his hands. 3 seconds passed. 5-8. Then, crack. The sound of vertebrae resetting echoed through the USJ like a gunshot. Izuku's neck straightened. His head lifted. The muscles in his back tensed and bulged, visibly expanding, the tissue density increasing in real time. The bone protrusions on his knuckles extended. They lengthened beyond their previous limit, jagged, blade-like growths that jutted 4 inches past his fists. Sharp enough to cut the air, his shoulders widened. New bone plating slid into position along his neck, thick, ridged armor protecting the cervical spine. His body was larger. His frame was more massive. Every adaptation his biology could make to survive kinetic shock at the Nomu's output level happened in the 6 seconds between death and resurrection. Izuku stood. His eyes burned solid red. No green remaining, no white, just blazing crimson that poured light across his cheekbones. His lips pulled back from his teeth. The sound that came out of him was below human register, a vibration more than a vocalization, something felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears. "I don't break!" The roar shook the windows of the facility. He hit the Nomu. The punch was different this time. His strength had multiplied beyond the threshold of shock absorption. The quirk tried to dampen the force, tried to eat the kinetic energy the way it was designed to, and it failed. The ceiling was reached. The buffer overflowed. The remaining force transferred through. The Nomu's chest caved inward. Its regeneration scrambled to keep up. Izuku hit it again, this time with the blade-like bone protrusion leading, the strike puncturing through the Nomu's abdomen and out its back. He ripped his arm free, grabbed the Nomu's right arm with both hands, pulled. The arm came off. Tendons and muscle and artificial connective tissue tore away from the shoulder socket with a sound like wet canvas being ripped. The Nomu's regeneration tried to reform it, new tissue sprouting from the stump, but Izuku was already swinging. He hit the Nomu with its own arm. The impact sent the creature sliding backward 20 meters. Izuku was on it before it stopped moving, a leap that covered the distance in a heartbeat. his body descending like a meteorite. He landed on the Nomu's chest. His fist came down. Again. Each blow punching through shock absorption, each strike landing with the full, undiminished force of a body that had died and returned stronger. The Nomu tried to grab him. Izuku caught both its hands. He squeezed. The bones in its fingers, whatever engineered composite they were made of, snapped like dry branches. He released one hand and drove an uppercut into the Nomu's jaw that lifted both of them off the ground. The creature's body went vertical. Izuku followed it upward, jumping, twisting, driving a second punch into the Nomu's exposed stomach that accelerated it through the USJ's domed ceiling. Glass and steel and insulation exploded outward as the Nomu punched through the roof and arced into the sky, rising until it was a dot against the clouds. It did not come back down. Izuku landed in the crater his own departure had made. His bone protrusions were extended to their maximum length, jagged white growths covering his shoulders, his spine, his forearms, his knuckles. His eyes still burned. His breathing was heavy, steady but deep, and when he exhaled, the air vibrated. He turned to face Shigaraki. The villain had taken 3 steps backward. His hand was off his face, his eyes were wide, and his pupils were dilated, and his mouth was open in an expression that didn't belong on the face of someone who planned murders for entertainment. He was afraid. That. Shigaraki's voice was a whisper. That was supposed to be unkillable. Izuku took a step toward him. The ground cracked under his foot. Kurogiri, Shigaraki said. Louder. Kurogiri. Now. The fog villain materialized the portal. Shigaraki stepped back into it, one hand raised, fingers twitching, and the last thing he said before disappearing was, "You're a monster. You're something worse than what we brought." The portal closed. The USJ fell silent. Izuku stood alone in the center of the destroyed plaza. His body was still in combat state, bone armor deployed, eyes burning, every muscle tensed and ready for the next threat. He breathed in, breathed out. The red in his eyes began to fade. The bone protrusions retracted slightly, still present, still extended beyond their resting state, but pulling back from the blade length they'd reached during the fight. He turned around. 20 students stared at him. Their faces were a gallery of human reaction. Kirishima's mouth was open. Todoroki's eyes were narrow with analytical intensity. Uraraka had her hands pressed to her chest. Ida stood rigid with his visor up. Tokoyami's eyes gleamed with something between respect and recognition. Mineta was crying. Momo was running toward him. She crossed the plaza at full sprint, past the debris, past the craters, past the Nomu's severed arm, still lying in a pool of artificial blood. She hit him at full speed, and her arms went around his midsection, and she pressed her face against his chest, against the bone plating and the dense, scarred skin and the heart that was beating strong and steady beneath it all. "You died," she said into his chest. "I watched you die." "I came back," he said. His arms came up around her. Careful, always careful. His bone-spiked forearms angled away from her body, his hands flat against her back. He held her the way you hold something precious and breakable when you are something that breaks everything. "You came back," she repeated. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. They stood like that until the sound of sirens began to filter through the broken dome above. The police were coming, the ambulances, the pro-heroes who should have been here sooner. All Might arrived 3 minutes later. He burst through the entrance of the USJ with his cape streaming and his smile fixed and his fists clenched, ready for war, ready to fight whatever had attacked his students. He found the plaza destroyed. The Nomu gone. The villains gone. And at the center of it all, a boy with bone armor and burning eyes holding a girl in his arms like the battle had ended an hour ago. All Might looked at the destruction, at the crater, at the hole in the ceiling, at the severed arm. Then he looked at Izuku Midoriya, and the symbol of peace saw something that made his smile falter in a way it never did in public. He saw the future, and it had teeth. The aftermath of the USJ attack changed everything. The media coverage was inescapable. Reporters who had been locked out of information about the villain attack found leaked footage from UA, security cameras, grainy, distant shots of the Nomu fight, of Izuku dying, of Izuku rising, of the Nomu being launched through a concrete ceiling by a student who looked like something from a fever dream. The footage went viral in hours. News anchors ran the clip in slow motion. Quirk analysts broke down what they could see frame by frame. Online forums exploded with debate. Who was this student? What was his quirk? How did he die and come back? Was UA hiding a weapon? The public reaction split three ways. Some called him a hero, a student who threw himself between his classmates and certain death. Some called him a monster, a thing that looked inhuman and fought with a savagery that made the Nomu look civilized. And some called him a question mark, something the world hadn't seen before, something that existed outside the neat categories of hero and villain and victim. All three reactions spread through UA as well. Teachers debated what to do with him. Students whispered about him in hallways. His classmates, the ones who had watched him die and return, treated him with a reverence that edged toward fear. They respected him. They were grateful to him. They were also fundamentally aware that they shared a classroom with something that could not be stopped by anything they'd yet seen. Bakugo spoke to nobody for 3 days after the attack. He sat in class with his jaw clenched and his eyes forward, and his hands still in his lap. Something had broken inside his certainty, the foundation of his identity, built on being the strongest, the most explosive, the most unstoppable, had crumbled when he watched Izuku Midoriya get his neck snapped and then beat the thing that did it to death with its own arm. Bakugo was forced to confront something he had been running from since age 13. The boy he had killed was unkillable. The boy he had dismissed as worthless was worth more than everything Bakugo had spent his life building. The sports festival approached 2 weeks later, and the pressure was enormous. Every hero agency in Japan watched the sports festival. It was the proving ground, the stage where first-year students demonstrated their worth to the professional world. Scouts from every top agency would be in the stands. Media coverage was total. And this year, there was a specific focus, the student from the USJ footage, the one who had fought the Nomu, the one who had died and risen. Izuku Midoriya was the headline before the festival even began. He walked into the arena on the day of the event and 50,000 people saw him for the first time in person. The bone ridges, the scarred pale skin, the frame that belonged on a pro hero in their prime, worn by a 15-year-old. The red threads in his eyes catching the stadium lights. He wore UA's gym uniform, and it stretched across his shoulders in a way that made his physique impossible to ignore. The crowd's reaction was audible, a wave of murmuring that swept through the stands as cameras focused on him and commentators struggled to describe what they were looking at. The obstacle race came first. Izuku finished it in 4 minutes. He ran through the robot zone without slowing. The machine swung at him and bounced off his body without effect. He leaped across the chasm with a single bound that cleared the entire gap by 20 meters. He sprinted through the minefield, triggering every mine he stepped on, each explosion detonating against his legs and accomplishing nothing. He finished first by a margin so large that the second-place finisher was still navigating the chasm when he crossed the line. The cavalry battle was next. Momo approached him before the teams were formed. "Be on my team," she said. It wasn't a request. "I'll put you on my shoulders if you want," he said, and there was a trace of humor in his rasp. "I want to be on top, actually. I can create equipment faster if I'm in a support position." Their team was simple. Izuku at the front carrying everything, Momo on top creating weapons and shields, with Tokoyami and his shadow beast Dark Shadow providing range defense. They were approached by a dozen other students wanting to join, but 4 was the maximum, and 3 was enough to protect any headband when Izuku was the one doing the protecting. The cavalry battle lasted 15 minutes. At the end of it, Izuku's team had every single headband in the arena. He had simply walked through every opposing team, his body impervious to their attacks, his hands reaching up and pulling headbands off their foreheads with a gentleness that was almost insulting. Teams that tried to fight him found their attacks bouncing off. Teams that tried to run found him covering distance in a single leap. Momo sat on top of the formation and kept a running count, her voice carrying clear instructions to Tokoyami, her hands producing metal shields and weighted projectiles as needed. She was efficient and sharp, and Izuku could hear the smile in her voice when she called out targets. The tournament bracket was announced after the cavalry battle. 16 students, single elimination, one-on-one fights. Izuku's name was at the top of the bracket. The crowd murmured again, louder this time, because everyone knew what they were about to watch. He moved through his early opponents with controlled force. The first was a student from Class B with a hardening quirk, his skin turned to stone. Izuku grabbed him by the belt and carried him to the edge of the ring and set him down outside of bounds. The fight lasted 11 seconds, and the stone student never even got to throw a punch. The second was Ibara Shiozaki, her vine hair extending in all directions, wrapping around Izuku's arms and legs and torso. He flexed once. Every vine snapped simultaneously. She stared at the stumps of her own hair in shock as he walked forward and pushed her gently out of bounds with one finger. The third was Katsuki Bakugo. The stadium went silent when the matchup was announced. The footage from the USJ was public knowledge. The combat training footage had leaked as well. Everyone knew what had happened between these two, or at least they knew what it looked like from the outside. What they didn't know was the factory. What they didn't know was the fire and the death and the resurrection. Bakugo walked to the ring with his jaw set. His explosions crackled in his palms, bigger than before, more volatile. He'd been training, he'd been pushing himself to a breaking point since the USJ, chasing a ceiling that might let him stand in the same arena as the thing Izuku had become. It wasn't enough. Bakugo opened with his strongest technique, a spinning aerial explosion that concentrated his blast into a focused point of impact. It hit Izuku square in the chest. The bone armor absorbed it. Izuku didn't step backward. Bakugo fired again and again. Explosions from every angle, above, below, from the side, concentrated, spread, using the AP shot technique he'd been developing in secret. Each blast hit Izuku and dissipated against armor that had been born in fire and refined past the point where Bakugo's maximum output could leave a mark. Izuku let him work. He stood there with his hands at his sides and let Bakugo exhaust himself. Every explosion that hit did less than the one before, because Izuku's body was adapting in real time, the skin thickening, the bone plating adjusting, the cellular response optimizing against this specific type and frequency of damage. When Bakugo's arms started to smoke, the strain of overuse blistering his own palms, Izuku took one step forward. Bakugo flinched. Izuku closed the distance in a heartbeat. His hand came up. He grabbed Bakugo by the front of his gym uniform, lifted him off the ground, turned, and set him down outside the boundary line with the same gentleness he'd used on Shiozaki. The fight was over. The crowd was silent for a full 3 seconds before the noise erupted. 50,000 people processing what they'd just seen. Bakugo stared at Izuku from outside the boundary. His hands were still smoking. His face held something that had passed beyond anger into territory he didn't have a name for. Izuku walked back to the center of the ring and waited for his next opponent. The semifinal was against Fumikage Tokoyami. Dark Shadow was powerful, a sentient shadow beast with immense physical strength. It hit Izuku from multiple angles, its form expanding to fill the space around him. The blows were heavy. They moved him. Dark Shadow's output was significant, but it was still just kinetic force. And kinetic force was something Izuku's body had been adapting against since the Nomu fight. He walked through Dark Shadow's assault. The Shadow Beast struck him and recoiled. Struck again and recoiled harder. The feedback was hurting it, each blow against Izuku's armored body sending the impact back through Dark Shadow's form. Tokoyami felt it, his teeth clenched. He pulled Dark Shadow back and surrendered before Izuku reached him. "You're beyond what I can fight," Tokoyami said. His voice was level, respectful. There's no shame in acknowledging a superior force of nature. Izuku nodded. The crowd cheered. The finals. Shadow Todoroki, Endeavor's son, walked to the ring with ice forming at his right hand and steam rising from his left. Half cold, half hot. The most powerful elemental quirk in Class 1A. His face was a mask of concentration, one eye gray, one eye blue, a burn scar spreading across the left side of his face like a map of his childhood. "I'll use everything," Todoroki said. "Both sides." "Good," Izuku said. The fight started with ice. Todoroki stamped his right foot and the glacier erupted from the ground like a living thing, a mountain of ice that covered the ring in a heartbeat, swallowing everything in its path. It hit Izuku at full force, encasing him in meters of solid, frozen mass. The ice was thick enough to trap a building. cold enough to drop the internal temperature of anything caught inside to lethal levels within seconds. The crowd gasped. Cameras flashed. Commentators scrambled to describe the scale of the ice attack. It reached the height of the stadium walls, a monument of frost and force. Inside the glacier, Izuku's body temperature dropped. He felt it happening. The cold seeping through his skin, past the bone armor, into his muscles and organs. His heartbeat slowed, his blood thickened, his core temperature fell below what human physiology could sustain. His extremities went numb, his vision dimmed, his heart stopped. For 2 seconds, Izuku Midoriya was dead inside a glacier of ice before 50,000 witnesses. Then his body responded. Deep within his cells, the adaptation triggered. Internal heat generation, a furnace igniting at the molecular level, his metabolism rewriting itself to produce thermal energy in quantities that defied thermodynamics. His core temperature spiked from 0 to 200 degrees in a single second. The glacier exploded. Ice flew in every direction. Chunks the size of cars hurtling into the stadium barriers, frost and steam erupting in a cloud that blinded the audience for 3 full seconds. The sound was tremendous, a boom that echoed off the stadium walls and hit the crowd like a physical force. People in the front rows threw their arms up. Heroes in the stands stood from their seats. When the fog cleared, Izuku stood at the center of the ring. Steam rose from his body in thick clouds. His skin glowed with internal heat, a faint red luminescence pulsing beneath the surface, visible between the bone protrusions and through the thinner areas of his scarred flesh. His eyes burned their brightest red. The ice beneath his feet had melted into a pool of water that evaporated on contact with his skin. He was alive. He was warm. The cold could never touch him again. Todoroki stared. His right side was useless now. The cold that had never failed him before had just been rendered permanently irrelevant against this opponent. He switched. His left side ignited. Flame poured from his arm in a torrent. A concentrated beam of fire hot enough to melt steel, aimed at Izuku's chest. The fire hit him and broke around his body like water around a stone. It didn't even warm his skin beyond what his own internal heat was already generating. Fire was the first thing that had ever killed him. Fire was the first thing he had ever become immune to. It was ancient history, written in his cells. "Your elements are wasted on me, Todoroki," Izuku said. The crowd heard it through the microphones. 50,000 people processed that sentence, the absolute, inarguable truth of it. This boy had survived being frozen to death and walked through fire without blinking in the span of 10 seconds. Todoroki let his flames die. He lowered his arm. He looked at Izuku with something that lived between respect and acceptance. "How do I fight you?" Todoroki asked. "You don't," Izuku said. Then he walked forward, steady, unhurried, his footsteps leaving evaporating puddles in the melted ice, and grabbed Todoroki by the collar of his gym uniform. He lifted him gently, turned, set him down outside the boundary line. "But you fought well," Izuku said. "Both sides. That matters." Todoroki looked at him. The tension in his jaw eased. He nodded once, the kind of nod between equals, even when the power gap between them was a canyon. The announcement came. Izuku Midoriya wins the UA Sports Festival. The crowd erupted. The noise was a physical wall of sound that pressed against the stadium and rolled outward across the city. Cameras flashed 100 at a time. Commentators shouted over each other. Present Mike's voice broke, trying to convey the magnitude of what 50,000 people had just witnessed. In the stands, pro heroes sat in stunned recalculation. Endeavor, the number 2 hero, Todoroki's father, stared at the boy in the center of the ring with an expression that blended fury and forced respect. He had trained his son to surpass All Might. His son couldn't touch this child. Best Genist leaned forward in his seat, his eyes narrowed. Hawks, young rising, the fastest hero in Japan, had his wings flared in what might have been excitement, or might have been the reflexive posture of a raptor recognizing a larger predator. All Might watched from the faculty box. His true form was thin and frail beneath his oversized suit. He coughed blood into his hand and felt the embers of One for All flicker in his chest. And he looked at Izuku Midoriya, standing in the arena like a monument to inevitable evolution. And he thought, this is what comes after me, and it isn't my successor. The medal ceremony placed Izuku on the podium. All Might presented the gold. The cameras captured the moment. the symbol of peace, placing a medal around the neck of a boy whose bone ridges gleamed under the stadium lights, whose body radiated visible heat, whose eyes held a dim red glow that the cameras couldn't quite capture correctly. Young Midoriya, All Might said, quietly enough that only Izuku heard. I don't know what you are, but whatever it is, use it well. I intend to, Izuku said. The crowd chanted his name. The weeks following the sports festival compressed around Izuku like a closing fist. Hero internships opened up, agencies across the country sending offers to first-year students based on their performance. Izuku received more offers than any student in UA history. The file on his desk was 3 inches thick with letters from top-tier agencies, all of them couching their interest in professional language while the subtext screamed, "We want to own whatever you are." He turned them all down except one. Gran Torino. A retired hero with a speed quirk and a connection to All Might that ran decades deep. His offer letter was one sentence, "Come here. I want to see this for myself." The address was a rundown apartment in Tokyo with no agency name attached. Izuku took the train alone. Momo was interning with Uwabami for media training, a smart choice for someone building a public image as the brain half of what the media was already calling a duo. She texted him the address of her agency and told him to stay safe. He texted back, "I'm the thing people need to be safe from." She sent a laughing emoji and then a heart, and then deleted the heart and sent a different emoji, and Izuku stared at his phone for the rest of the train ride with something warm in his chest that had nothing to do with his internal heat generation. Gran Torino's apartment was empty when he arrived. The door was unlocked. Izuku stepped inside and found a small dusty room with a kitchenette and a couch, and no sign of its occupant. A blur hit him from the right, feet connected with the side of his head, not hard enough to hurt, just hard enough to snap his neck sideways and demonstrate that something was very, very fast. The blur resolved into a tiny old man with wild white hair and a yellow cape. He stood on the kitchenette counter with his arms crossed, bouncing lightly on his feet. "You're slower than I expected," Gran Torino said. "You're faster than I expected," Izuku said, rubbing his neck. "That's the point, kid. You can take a hit from God and walk it off, but you fight like a bull. Forward. Always forward. What happens when something is faster than you can track?" Izuku thought about it. "I survive whatever it does to me and adapt." "And what if it doesn't stay to let you adapt? What if it hits you and leaves? What if the target isn't you? It's someone behind you?" Gran Torino's eyes were sharp. "You're unkillable. Congratulations. The people you protect aren't. Speed matters. Timing matters. You need to learn how to fight things that won't stand still." The internship lasted a week. Gran Torino spent every day of it attacking Izuku from angles he couldn't predict, using his jet quirk to ricochet off walls and ceilings, striking from above, below, behind. Izuku couldn't catch him. His body was fast for its size, but Gran Torino was a different category of velocity, the kind of speed that turned the old man into a pinball with combat experience. By the third day, Izuku's reflexes had sharpened. His body adapted, his eyes tracking faster, his neck muscles strengthening to allow more rapid head movement, his peripheral awareness expanding. By the 5th day, he caught Gran Torino mid-flight, and the old man had to burst jet out of his grip. "Better," Gran Torino said, still too slow to catch Stain. "Stain? The hero killer. He's in Hosu City, near where your class rep is interning." Gran Torino's expression hardened. "He kills heroes. He's fast, faster than anything you've fought, and his quirk works through blood contact. One lick and you're paralyzed." Izuku filed the information away. His body was warm in the apartment. The bone ridges on his knuckles clicked softly as he flexed his hands. "If he comes," Izuku said, "I'll handle it." You say that about everything, and I'm always right." Gran Torino almost smiled. Hosu City burned on the 5th night of internships. 3 Nomu, lesser versions, produced in batches by the League, dropped into the city from an airborne portal. They hit the streets running, tearing through buildings, and attacking civilians with mindless aggression. Pro-heroes responded immediately, but the Nomu were designed to occupy and survive, and the chaos they created was the distraction. Stain was the real threat. The hero killer moved through Hosu's back alleys with the precision of someone who had memorized the city's layout. His targets were specific, heroes he deemed false, heroes who fought for money or fame or status rather than genuine purpose. He had killed 17 of them over the past year. His katana never missed. Tenya Ida was in Hosu, interning with Manuel, a mid-tier hero whose water quirk made him useful in rescue but marginal in combat. Ida was there for one reason, to find Stain. His brother Ingenium had been paralyzed by the hero killer 6 months prior. Ida wanted revenge. He found it. In an alley 3 blocks from the central fire, Ida cornered Stain over the body of the hero native who lay paralyzed and bleeding on the ground. You? Ida's engines roared to life. He charged. Stain moved like smoke. His katana flicked, and Ida's engine calf was opened in a single slash. Ida fell. The blood from his legs splattered the ground, and Stain's tongue was on it before Ida could register what had happened. Ida froze. Every muscle in his body locked. Stain's blood curdle activated through the ingested blood, and Ida hit the ground face first, immobilized, his eyes wide and his body betraying every command his brain sent. Stain stood over him. His costume was dark and wrapped tight around a lean, muscular frame. His bandages covered his missing nose. His eyes were wide and intense. The eyes of a true believer, someone whose ideology had swallowed everything else about him and left only the blade and the mission. Another false hero, Stain said. Fighting for revenge instead of justice. You're the worst kind. The kind that wears the uniform while poisoning what it means. He raised his katana. Something landed in the alley. The impact cracked the ground in a spider web pattern that ran wall to wall. The shockwave pushed air outward hard enough to disturb Stain's bandages and ruffle his hair. Dust rose. A figure stood at the mouth of the alley, massive, bone-armored, with eyes that glowed red in the dimness and a presence that made the air in the alley feel heavier. Izuku had tracked the fight from 3 blocks away. He'd felt the Nomu attacks begin, the distant tremors of their destruction carrying through the pavement, and he'd moved toward the highest concentration of combat energy. When Momo's text came through, Ida's GPS stopped moving. Hosu back alleys. Please go. He'd changed course instantly. He stepped forward. His footsteps cracked the pavement. Stain turned. His eyes swept over Izuku's form, the bone protrusions, the armored skin, the glowing eyes, and his expression didn't waver. The hero killer had fought dozens of pro-heroes. He had killed men twice Izuku's age with the confidence of someone who believed his cause made him invincible. Another one, Stain said. His voice was steady, almost approving. You look like someone who fights for real. Are you a real hero, boy, or just another fraud in costume? Let them go, Izuku said. His voice was low. The rasp of it echoed in the alley. Stain moved. It was fast, the fastest combat speed Izuku had ever faced. Gran Torino's warnings materialized in real time. Stain crossed 5 meters in a blink. His katana was a silver line that cut through the dim light. The blade sliced across Izuku's hamstring, finding the gap between bone protrusions at the back of his knee. The cut was deep. Blood spilled. Stain's tongue was on the blade before Izuku could turn. Blood curdle activated. Izuku's muscles locked. Every fiber in his body seized simultaneously. He felt it, the toxin in his bloodstream, binding to his motor neurons, shutting down voluntary movement at the signal level. His legs gave out. He fell to one knee, then forward, hitting the ground face first with a thud that cracked the concrete. He could still see. His eyes worked. He could see Stain stepping over him, could see the hero killer moving toward Ida, could see natives still bleeding on the ground behind them. Then Stain turned back. He looked down at Izuku. The student hadn't screamed, hadn't begged, had hit the ground with the silence of someone who understood what was happening and was already calculating past it. Interesting, Stain said. He knelt. His katana came up. He placed the point against Izuku's back, testing, reading, trying to find the gap between the bone plates that covered his spine. He found a seam near the base of the rib cage. You have the eyes of someone real, Stain said. But I need to be sure. A real hero survives this. A false one dies. He drove the katana through Izuku's back. The blade punched through the seam in his bone armor, through his chest cavity, and into his heart. Izuku felt it. The steel entering his body, the cold of the metal inside him. His heart, already slowing from the blood-curdle paralysis, spasmed around the blade. Beat once, twice. Stopped, his vision dimmed. The last thing he saw before the black took him was Stain's boots walking away from him toward Ida. He died. In the alley, Momo was running. She had tracked Izuku's location through the phone GPS she'd insisted he keep active during internship. She was 3 blocks away. Her internship costume, practical, equipped with a belt full of her own creations, jingled as she sprinted through burning streets. Her breath came fast. Her heart hammered. Todoroki was with her. They'd found each other near one of the Nomu attacks. When Momo had said Midoriya is in trouble, Todoroki had followed without hesitation. They reached the alley. Momo saw Izuku face down on the ground with a katana through his back. Her legs nearly gave out. The world narrowed to that single image, the boy she cared about, motionless, with a blade in his heart and blood pooling beneath him. She had seen him die once before, at the USJ. She had thought she was prepared for it this time. She wasn't. Todoroki fired ice at Stain, a snap freeze that covered the ground between them and forced the hero killer to leap backward. Stain landed on a fire escape and assessed the new arrivals with the composure of a professional. More false heroes, Stain said. The boy on the ground, he was real. It's a shame. Momo moved toward Izuku's body. Todoroki kept the pressure on Stain, alternating fire and ice, creating barriers, forcing the hero killer to maintain distance. He couldn't close to blood contact range with a wall of flame between them. Momo knelt beside Izuku. Her hands went to his neck. No pulse. Her fingers were wet with his blood. She felt the bone protrusions under her palms, the ridges she'd memorized over weeks of training together. And they were still. His body was still. Everything was still. "Come back," she whispered. "You always come back. Come back." 20 seconds passed. 30. And then a massive bone-plated hand closed around Stain's ankle from behind. The hero killer had been focused on Todoroki, deflecting ice, weaving between fire bursts, reading the half-and-half boy's patterns. He hadn't been watching the corpse behind him. He hadn't considered that the dead body with a sword through its heart would reach up and grab him. Stain looked down. Izuku's face stared up at him. His eyes were open, burning red. His chest, the wound was sealed over with a layer of bone, plating so dense and thick that it looked like white ceramic armor bolted across his torso. The katana that had killed him lay beside him on the ground. The blade snapped off at the hilt where his body had rejected it during the healing process. He stood. The process was violent, his body lifting from prone to standing in a single motion, powered by muscles that were larger and denser than they had been 60 seconds ago. His frame had expanded again. The bone protrusions on his forearms were thicker, bladed, edged with a new sharpness. His neck was armored, fresh plating covering the cervical spine and the sides of his throat, making his head look like it emerged from a biological helmet. His blood, the blood Stain had consumed, was different now. The blood-curdle toxin that had locked his muscles had been metabolized. His cells had encoded the immunity. Paralysis-type blood, quirks would never work on him again. And the blade, the steel that had pierced his heart, his skin was now reinforced against edged weapons at that material strength. Blades at that composition would break against him. Stain ripped his ankle free. He drew a secondary blade, a shorter knife from his belt, and slashed at Izuku's throat. The knife struck the bone plating on his neck, and the blade shattered into fragments that scattered across the alley like metal confetti. Stain stared at his empty hand. "You shouldn't have done that," Izuku said. His voice was a grinding sound. Low. Final. The words carried the weight of a promise that had already been fulfilled. Stain moved, that incredible speed, that blur of muscle and reflex, and pulled a third blade from his thigh sheath. He slashed at Izuku's face. The blade hit the bone ridges along his jaw and snapped. He reversed the grip and stabbed at Izuku's eye. Izuku caught his wrist. The grip closed. Stain felt the bones in his wrist compress. The pain was instant and enormous, a crushing force that threatened to powder every bone in his forearm if the hand squeezed 1 millimeter harder. Izuku's other hand came up. He grabbed Stain by the throat, lifted him. The hero killer's feet left the ground. His remaining blades clattered to the alley floor. For one moment, Stain and Izuku were eye to eye. The hero killer, the man who had murdered 17 pro heroes, who believed his mission was righteous, who had never once shown fear in combat, looked into those burning red eyes and saw something that made his ideology irrelevant. He saw something that could not be killed. Something that came back from every death stronger, angrier, more armored, more dangerous. something that would never stop rising. He had driven a sword through its heart, and it had grabbed him 60 seconds later. Izuku squeezed. Stain's collarbone cracked under the pressure, a sound like a stick breaking. The hero killer's face contorted in pain. His body went limp. Izuku turned and threw him. Stain hit the brick wall at the end of the alley with a force that cratered the surface and rained dust from 3 stories above. He slid to the ground unconscious. His body crumpled in a heap of dark wrappings and broken ideology. The alley was silent. Izuku stood at the center of it, steam rising from his skin where the internal heat generation bled through. His bone armor was at full extension, every protrusion visible, every ridge sharp, every plate locked. He looked like something from ancient mythology, a guardian statue come to life, bristling with weapons made of his own body. He breathed. Slowly, the red in his eyes dimmed. The protrusions retracted, pulling back toward his body. The heat faded. The monster retreated inward and left the boy standing there, bruised, blood-stained, his internship costume hanging in ruins, his face still carrying those bone ridges, but his expression softening into something human. He turned. Momo was standing 5 meters behind him. Todoroki was beside her, ice still forming at his fingertips. Ida was on the ground, the blood curdle wearing off, his fingers twitching as motor control returned. Momo looked at Izuku. At the blood on his chest from where the katana had been. At the new bone plating that hadn't been there before. At his face. That face she had touched in gentleness. That face she had studied in fascination. That face that belonged to a boy who kept dying and coming back for people who needed him. She ran to him. Her arms went around him. Her face pressed against his chest, against the new bone armor, warm from his internal heat, smooth and hard and alive. The bone spikes along his shoulders and arms jutted around her, making the embrace look dangerous from the outside. She ignored them. She had always ignored them. From the first moment she touched his arm in the UA cafeteria, she had treated the monster as the armor and the boy inside as the truth. Izuku's arms closed around her. Careful. Always careful. His hands pressed flat against her back. No grip, just contact, just warmth, just presence. The blade-like protrusions on his forearms angled away from her body. He held her the way he always held her, like she was the only thing in the world more important than the fight. "You died again," she said. Her voice was muffled against his chest. "I know. I watched it happen again. I know. I'm sorry." She pulled back enough to look up at his face. Her eyes were wet, but her expression was fierce, angry and relieved and proud all at once. "Stop apologizing for surviving." He looked down at her. The bone ridges along his jaw caught the dim light of the alley. His eyes, still faintly threaded with red, still carrying the echo of the killing rage that had held him moments ago, softened as they found hers. "I'll always come back," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what terrifies me, because every time you come back, it means you had to go first." He had no answer for that. He held her tighter, carefully, always carefully. And above them, the fires in Hosu City burned on, and beneath them, Stain lay broken and unconscious, and around them, the world continued to turn, and none of it mattered in this moment. The boy who could not be killed and the girl who refused to fear him, standing together in the aftermath like proof that something monstrous could still hold something precious without breaking it. Todoroki watched from the edge of the scene. His expression was unreadable, but when Ida managed to push himself up on shaking arms and look at what was happening, Todoroki put a hand on his shoulder and kept him quiet. Some moments deserved their space. The pro heroes arrived 8 minutes later. They found Stain unconscious and restrained with capture tape Momo had produced from her arm. They found Native stabilized with first aid equipment Momo had created. They found Ida sitting against the wall with his injured leg bandaged. And they found Izuku Midoriya standing in the center of the alley with his arms around a girl and 3 broken blades at his feet and a hole in his costume where a sword had gone through his heart. The police took statements. Endeavor arrived, drawn by the fire and the chaos, and stared at Izuku with the same expression he'd worn at the sports festival. A complex calculation playing out behind his eyes, running the numbers on what it meant to share a world with something that survived being stabbed through the heart and came back immune to knives. The media would never get the full story of what happened in that alley. The official report credited the hero internship students with detaining the hero killer through teamwork and determination. It mentioned Todoroki's ice and Momo's tactical equipment and Ida's initial engagement. It did not mention that Izuku had died. It did not mention the resurrection. Some truths were kept inside the walls of UA and the inner circles of pro-hero society because the public was not ready to know that a 15-year-old boy could die and come back stronger. But the people who were in that alley knew. Todoroki knew. Ida knew. Momo knew. And they would never forget it. On the train back to Musutafu the next morning, Momo sat beside Izuku. The car was nearly empty. Early morning, post-incident fatigue keeping most commuters home. She leaned against his arm. The bone ridge on his shoulder pressed against the side of her head, and she adjusted without complaint, finding the groove between protrusions where her temple fit. "Your body metabolized blood curdle," she said. Her voice was quiet, not from deference but from exhaustion. "That means your immune system encoded a defense against ingested blood-type paralysis quirks. The implication is extraordinary. If your cells can counter quirk-based biochemical agents, the adaptation isn't purely physical. It's operating at the quirk factor interaction level." Momo: "Yes? You can study me later. Sleep now." She huffed, but her eyes closed, her breathing slowed, her weight settled against him. Fully trusting, fully relaxed against the body that bristled with weapons and radiated enough heat to warm the train car around them. Izuku looked out the window. The countryside scrolled past, green and gold in the early light. His reflection in the glass showed him what he was: the bone ridges, the thick scarred skin, the red threads in his eyes. A monster by any standard the world used to judge appearance, but Momo slept against him like he was made of something soft. He closed his eyes. The world beyond the glass kept moving. The cities and the fields and the society of heroes and villains and the public that watched them all through screens and rankings and opinion polls. That world was changing because of him. The sports festival had broadcast his existence to millions. The hero killer's defeat would spread further. Every time he showed what he could do, the reactions multiplied. Fear, admiration, obsession, calculation. He was 15. He was a first-year student at the most prestigious hero academy in Japan. He was a boy who liked analysis notebooks and hero history, and the way Momo's voice changed when she was excited about data, he was also something that could not be stopped, something that grew from every wound. Something that carried the deaths it had suffered as armor, and the people it loved as purpose. The train carried them both toward tomorrow, and whatever came next would find Izuku Midoriya ready. Because readiness, for him, was not preparation. It was certainty. The certainty of something that had been broken in every way the world knew how to break a person and had risen each time carrying more than it had before. Momo's hand found his in her sleep. Her fingers threaded between his, between the armored knuckles and the bone ridges, and held on. He held back, and the world outside kept burning in ways large and small, and he knew that he would meet every fire with the same answer he had always given. He would walk through it, and he would be standing when it stopped, and the people behind him would be safe because he was the wall between them and everything else. That was who he was. That was what he was built for. Through pain and death and resurrection, through fire and cold and steel, through every attempt the world had made to prove him breakable, he was Izuku Midoriya, and nothing the world had thrown at him had ever been enough, and nothing ever would be. The train pulled into Musutafu Station, and Momo's eyes opened before Izuku's hand moved. She straightened against his shoulder, blinked twice, and reached up to touch her hair where it had pressed flat against the bone ridge. Neither of them said anything. She gathered her bag. He gathered his. They stepped onto the platform together, and the morning commuters parted around them the way people part around something they can't identify, but know to give space. 3 news vans were parked outside UA's main gate when Izuku arrived the next morning. Reporters with cameras pressed against the fence, their questions overlapping into noise. His name was in every question. What happened in Hosu? What he was? Whether UA would comment. The security gate scanned his ID and the barrier opened and he walked through without turning his head, and the cameras tracked him all the way up the entrance path until the doors swallowed him. The hallways were different. Students from other classes slowed when he passed. Some stopped walking entirely. A second year with a light-emitting quirk actually pressed herself flat against the wall as he went by, her eyes wide, and he felt a familiar twinge of something that wasn't quite guilt, but lived in the same neighborhood. He kept walking. Aizawa's message came through his phone before first period. My office. Now. The underground hero's office was a small, cluttered room on the faculty floor. Aizawa sat behind his desk with a coffee that had gone cold and a stack of papers that looked like government correspondence. He didn't stand when Izuku entered. He didn't offer a seat. He just looked at him. Every agency in Japan is calculating what you are worth to them, Aizawa said. His voice was flat, factual, the way he delivered all information that mattered. Every villain in Japan is calculating what it would take to make you fail. Neither of them gets to be right. He held Izuku's gaze. Figure out what you're doing this for. Izuku stood in the doorway. The bone ridges on his forearms were visible below his rolled-up sleeve. He'd stopped trying to hide them weeks ago. He nodded once. He turned to leave. Aizawa's voice caught him at the door. The girl, Yaoyorozu. Aizawa paused. She submitted a full biological analysis of your adaptation cycle to the support department. 40 pages. Don't waste what people do for you. Izuku stopped walking. He didn't turn around. He nodded again. Then he left. He found Momo in the support lab during lunch period. She was wearing lab goggles pushed up on her forehead, her uniform jacket draped over a stool, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. She was mid-sentence with a support course student, something about tensile strength coefficients in titanium alloy versus carbon fiber composites. And when she saw Izuku in the doorway, she finished her point, patted the support student on the shoulder, and walked to him. You read it, she said. Not a question. Aizawa told me. She looked at him for a moment. That evaluating warmth lived in her expression, the look she gave him when she was processing something about him that mattered to her beyond the scientific. I have 17 more pages I didn't submit, she said. They're for you, not for them. What do they say? Her lips curved. Just slightly. Come to dinner and I'll tell you. The word left him before his brain could overthink it. Yes. She smiled fully then, brief and bright, and turned back to the support student. Izuku stood in the doorway for 2 more seconds, feeling something in his chest that his adaptation cycle had never produced. Warmth that came from nowhere and meant something he was still learning to name. The gym at 5 a.m. was supposed to be empty. Izuku arrived the next morning in his training clothes, the bone protrusions on his shoulders catching the fluorescent strip lighting. He was mid-stretch when the door opened behind him, and a familiar crackling filled the room like static electricity in the air before a storm. Bakugo stood in the entrance, hands in his pockets, jaw set. He looked like he'd been awake for hours and was fighting something internal that had nothing to do with physical training. You're stronger than anything, Bakugo said. His voice was tight but steady. Everyone knows it. I know it. And you still... He stopped, started again. I'm going to surpass you, not because I need to prove something, because you deserve an opponent who can actually push you. Izuku looked at him for a long time. The fluorescent light hummed above them. The gym equipment sat in rows, barbells and impact pads and reinforced heavy bags that Izuku went through 3 of per week. Then get stronger, Izuku said. That was all. He went back to his stretch. Bakugo watched for a moment, something working behind his eyes, some internal process completing, and then he walked to the other end of the gym and started training. They said nothing else. The sound of Bakugo's explosions against the reinforced pads filled one half of the room. The sound of Izuku's fists cracking, impact targets filled the other. They trained in parallel until the sun came up and the other students began filtering toward campus, and neither acknowledged what had shifted between them because acknowledgement would have cheapened it. They were not friends. They were not enemies. They were 2 forces that had decided the same space was large enough for both of them. That was new. That was enough. The restaurant Momo chose was small and tucked behind a bookstore 2 blocks from UA's East Gate, the kind of place that served elevated comfort food and kept the lights low enough that Izuku's bone ridges didn't catch the attention of every diner in the room. She'd chosen it for that reason. He knew this without asking. She thought about things like that, the spaces where he could exist without being stared at. And the fact that she thought about it at all made something in him ache in the best possible way. She had her phone on the table. The 17 pages were pulled up. She scrolled to the first section and read it aloud while they waited for food. Her voice low enough that only he could hear, her inflection shifting between the clinical precision of the data and something softer when the observations became personal. Your bone protrusions settle flatter when you are at rest, she read. They extend slightly in states of alertness. They lock into full deployment when something or someone you care about is in danger. She looked up from the screen. You're not just adapting to physical threats. Your body reads emotional stakes. It treats the people you protect as a survival variable. He looked at his hands on the table. The ridged knuckles, the thick scarred fingers that could bend steel without trying. That explains why they always extended at the exam, he said, when the missile was heading toward you, before I'd even decided to move. Momo was very still. The restaurant murmured around them, other diners clinking glasses, the low beat of background music. But at their table, the silence held a shape. Yes, she said, that is what the data shows. The silence between them carried more than anything either of them said next. The food arrived. They ate. She continued reading. Observations about his rest state versus combat state. Metabolic markers she tracked through his training sessions. The way his internal temperature rose 2 degrees in her presence versus his baseline. She said that last one with a slight flush along her cheekbones, and he stared at his plate for a moment before the corner of his mouth twitched. Before they left, he reached across the table and took her hand. Both of them were fully aware of what it meant. Her fingers closed around his armored knuckles without hesitation. She had never hesitated with him. Not once. Not since the entrance exam when she'd asked about his bone growth response to specific threat stimuli while covered in dust and still shaking from almost dying. That was who she was, the person who reached toward the thing everyone else stepped away from. They walked back to campus hand in hand in the evening dark, and his internal heat kept her warm, and the bone ridges on his fingers pressed against the softness of her palm, and she didn't adjust her grip even once. The end-of-term practical exams arrived with a weight that settled over Class 1A like humidity before a storm. The format was announced in homeroom. Teams of students paired against pro heroes. The matchups were posted on the classroom board. Most were logical, designed to test specific weaknesses, force creative problem-solving, push students beyond their comfort zones. Izuku's matchup was at the bottom of the list, and when the class read it, the room went silent. Midoriya Izuku versus All Might. No partner, one-on-one, full power. Kirishima broke the silence first. That's insane. Momo didn't speak. She looked at Izuku. He was reading the board with his arms crossed, his expression unchanged. The bone ridges on his forearms shifted once, a subtle contraction, reading the situation, and settled. When? He asked Aizawa. Tomorrow. Industrial test environment. Full scale. Aizawa's eyes held something that might have been concern buried under layers of professional composure. Principal Nezu's orders. Izuku nodded. He sat back down. The class watched him and he gave them nothing. No fear, no bravado, no performance. He pulled out his notebook and started writing. Momo saw his pen moving across the page in the rapid shorthand of his analysis habit. All Might's known speed ceiling, like estimated power output of a standard Detroit smash, the time limit imposed by his injury. She leaned over. What are you thinking? I'm thinking he's faster than me and more experienced than me and stronger per individual impact than anything I've taken yet. He kept writing. I'm also thinking that none of those things matter if I don't stay down. That's not a strategy. He looked at her. The red threading in his eyes caught the classroom light. It's not a strategy. It's a fact. The industrial test environment was a steel-framed complex the size of a city block, open spaces, corridors, multi-level platforms, a central arena with reinforced walls designed to absorb hero-level impacts. Cameras lined every surface. In the observation room, 18 students sat in front of screens and watched as Izuku walked to the center of the arena and All Might entered from the opposite side. All Might in his hero form was still a presence that bent the air around it. Massive, golden, smiling. But Izuku could see it now. could see what Gran Torino had hinted at, what Recovery Girl's medical reports implied. The edges of that form were thinner than they should be. The transformation held, but it held the way a rope holds under strain, functional until the instant it wasn't. Young Midoriya, All Might said, his voice filled the arena. I won't insult you by holding back. Good, Izuku said. He dropped his arms to his sides. The bone protrusions on his forearms and shoulders shifted into a higher state. Not full combat deployment, but ready. Alert, All Might vanished. The speed was beyond anything Izuku had tracked before. Not faster than the Nomu, faster in a different way. The Nomu had been a freight train. All Might was lightning. The first hit came from the left, a hook that connected with Izuku's ribs and sent him sideways 4 meters, his feet carving furrows in the steel floor. Before he could turn, the second hit landed from above, a downward palm strike to his shoulder that drove him to one knee, the floor buckling beneath him. The third came from behind, a kick to the center of his back that launched him forward into the arena wall. The wall cracked around his body. He peeled himself free. All Might was already somewhere else. Izuku turned, and the next punch was coming from a new angle, each strike landing in a different place, a different force direction, preventing his adaptation from locking onto a pattern. All Might knew. He understood what he was fighting, and he was working the gaps. 90 seconds of this. Izuku took 14 hits in 90 seconds, and each one hurt, and none of them hurt the same way twice. His body was adapting, the bone plating thickening at each impact point, but All Might was too fast and too varied for any single adaptation to address the whole problem, so Izuku stopped. He planted his feet at the center of the arena. He dropped his arms to his sides. He closed his eyes. In the observation room, Momo leaned forward. What is he doing? All Might slowed. The strategy shift was unexpected. He circled at distance, reading the change, and then he moved. Another blinding attack aimed at Izuku's exposed chest. Izuku's arm came up, not fast enough to match All Might's speed, but positioned where the strike was going to be. His eyes were still closed, but his body was tracking something else. Air pressure, floor vibrations, sound displacement. The physical wake of All Might's movement through space. The block connected. Not clean, the force drove Izuku back 3 meters that had one knee gouging the floor, but he didn't fall. His hand closed around All Might's extended forearm. The bone ridges on his fingers locked into the grip like a vice made of natural armor. For 1 second, the two of them were frozen. The symbol of peace and the thing that would come after him. All Might pulled. His muscles bulged beneath his hero costume, the full strength of the most powerful man in Japan straining against a 15-year-old's grip. Izuku's arm trembled. His bone plating was thickening in real time around his fingers, reinforcing the grip at the cellular level. He held. Let go, All Might said. Izuku's eyes opened. Red, burning. Make me. All Might made him. The next 90 seconds were a different fight. All Might committed to power. 3 rapid strikes to Izuku's chest with his free hand while his trapped arm strained against the grip. The first punch cracked Izuku's sternum. The second drove the fracture deeper. The third shattered it outright and sent bone fragments into his chest cavity. Izuku's hand released. He flew backward 20 meters and hit the far wall hard enough to embed himself in the steel. He hung there for 2 seconds. The observation room was dead silent. Then his sternum cracked back into place, audible through the cameras, and he dropped to the floor and stood. All Might was already in motion. He threw steel support beams from the arena's upper structure, each one a projectile that weighed half a ton. Izuku walked through them. They hit him and bent around his frame and fell away. A shockwave punch collapsed the ceiling section above him, tons of steel and reinforcement crashing down on his position. He planted his feet and let it bury him. 3 seconds of silence. Then the pile erupted upward. Izuku burst free with his bone protrusions fully deployed, shoulders, spine, forearms, the spinal crest prominent and gleaming. He was bleeding from 7 places, and every one of those wounds was closing as the class watched. His body was larger. The repeated high-force impacts were compounding his baseline, each adaptation making the next one come faster. All Might stood across the arena. His smile held, but his body was shaking. The cost of sustaining this fight, of maintaining his hero form under the strain of full power combat, was visible in the tremor of his hands and the tightness around his eyes. He committed everything to a single blow. The wind-up was minimal. All Might was too experienced for theatrical preparation. But the weight of what gathered in his fist was visible in the way the air compressed around his arm, the way the floor beneath his feet cracked from the force being channeled through his legs. A Detroit smash. Full power. Everything remaining. It hit Izuku in the chest. The sound was a detonation. The shockwave blew every loose piece of material in the arena to the walls. The cameras nearest to the impact point went dark. In the observation room, the screens flickered and Kirishima was on his feet and Momo's hands were pressed against the desk surface hard enough to whiten her knuckles. Izuku flew. He hit the far wall. He went through it. The wall, reinforced steel 3 inches thick, designed to absorb pro-hero level impacts, tore apart around him like paper. He crashed into the next section of the environment. Dust and rubble and the sound of structural collapse filled the space. The arena was silent. All Might stood alone at the center, his fist still extended, his muscle form flickering at the edges, blood at the corner of his mouth. He was staring at the hole in the wall. 10 seconds. 15. Then the rubble moved. Izuku walked out of the hole in the wall. His chest armor had reformed, thicker, denser, restructured around the new impact threshold. The crack that had been his sternum was now solid bone plating in a configuration that hadn't existed 30 seconds ago. His arm was healed. His eyes burned at their most intense red. He took one step forward and the floor cracked beneath his foot from the sheer force contained in the movement. He looked at All Might across the destroyed arena. All Might's muscle form was failing, the transformation pulling apart at the seams, his frame thinning, his features becoming gaunt and hollow. The embers of One for All were guttering inside him. "You hit harder than anything I've been hit by," Izuku said. His voice was steady, warm, even. The warmth of genuine respect from something that had just weathered the worst the world's greatest hero could produce. "Thank you." All Might stared at him. The hero form dropped. The thin, skeletal man stood there in the oversized costume, bones visible through papery skin, eyes sunken, body held upright by will alone. He raised his hand, palm open. The gesture universal. You pass. In the observation room, the silence lasted 5 full seconds. Then Kirishima made a sound that wasn't a word and wasn't a yell, but carried every feeling the room contained. Uraraka was gripping Tsuyu's arm hard enough to leave marks. Todoroki watched with narrowed eyes, processing. Bakugo stared at the screen with an expression that belonged to someone watching a mountain grow in real time. Momo's hands were still pressed to the desk. Her eyes were bright. Her mouth was a thin line of something that lived between terror and pride and absolute certainty. She'd known he would stand. She'd known before the punch landed. She'd written it in her notes. There is no documented upper limit to his adaptation threshold. There may not be one. After the arena cleared, after the support crews swept the wreckage and the medical team confirmed that Izuku required 0 treatment, they stood together in the ruins. Just the 2 of them. All Might in his true form. Izuku still carrying the fading glow of full deployment, his bone protrusions retracting to their resting state. "I've been trying to decide," All Might said, "whether you're the next symbol of peace or something this world has never needed a category for." "What did you decide?" All Might coughed. Blood spotted his handkerchief. He pocketed it, too late, Izuku had already seen, and looked at the boy with eyes that carried decades of weight. "I decided it doesn't matter. What matters is what you decide to do with what you are." Izuku filed it away. The blood, the cough, the man who held up the world running out of time to hold it. He said nothing about it, but he carried it forward the way his body carried everything, woven into the structure of what came next. Summer training camp. The Pussycats Forest Reserve. A sprawling wildland an hour outside the city, thick with trees and uneven terrain, and the kind of isolation that made it perfect for intensive training away from media pressure. Class 1A arrived by bus, and the energy was different from the early days at UA. They were a class that had survived the USJ together. They'd watched each other fight at the sports festival. They'd grown, individually and as a group, in ways that showed in how they moved, how they carried their quirks, how they looked at each other. Izuku stood at the cliff edge where the Pussycats introduced themselves, the forest sprawling below, and he breathed the mountain air and felt his body at rest for the first time in weeks. The bone protrusions on his shoulders were low and flush, their resting state, what Momo had called his baseline confidence configuration. The forest was alive with sound and movement, and it was the most peaceful environment he'd occupied since the semester began. It lasted 3 days. On the third night, the forest burned. The Vanguard Action Squad hit the camp at dusk. Figures moving through the trees with purpose, trailing fire and poison gas and the sharp signatures of combat. Quirks deployed with lethal intent. The attack was coordinated. Multiple vectors. The gas pushed students towards specific choke points. The fire cut escape routes, and the fighters, the real threats, moved through the chaos towards specific targets. Izuku smelled the smoke before the alarm sounded. He was on his feet and moving before the rest of his training group processed what was happening. His bone protrusions extending, his body shifting into combat configuration, the internal heat rising in response to the threat signature his cells were reading from the air. "Stay together," he told the students near him. "Move toward the main cabin. Don't separate." Then he ran toward the fire. The forest became a war zone. Flames licked up the trees in walls of orange and black smoke. Izuku moved through them, the fire touching his skin and accomplishing nothing, the heat registering as a faint warmth that his immunity reduced to background noise. Through the smoke and between the burning trunks, he tracked the sounds of combat. Somewhere to his left, he heard Todoroki's ice cracking. Somewhere ahead, Bakugo's explosions. The class was fighting. The class was holding. He broke through a wall of flame into a clearing near the cliff edge and found Muscular. The villain was enormous. 6 feet of overdeveloped muscle fiber wrapped around a human frame like armor made of meat. His augmentation quirk pulsed beneath his skin, compressed biological material expanding outward in thick cords that doubled the width of his arms and packed his torso with combat mass. He wore a grin that belonged to someone who enjoyed this work. At his feet, a small boy lay crumpled against the rock face. Koda, the pussycat's ward, a child no older than 6, unconscious and bleeding from a hit that should never have been thrown at someone his size. "Another hero kid," Muscular said, turning. His augmented arm flexed. Muscle fibers shifted and packed tighter. "You all look the same to me." Izuku said nothing. He walked to Koda, picked the boy up with one arm, his grip feather-light, his bone-spiked forearm angled away from the child's body. He set him carefully against the rock face, away from the cliff edge, sheltered from the wind. Then he straightened. He turned to face Muscular. The villain was already swinging. The augmented fist came like a wrecking ball. Massive, packed with fiber density that multiplied the kinetic output beyond what natural muscle could achieve. It connected with Izuku's face. His head snapped sideways. The bone ridge along his jaw cracked at the impact point, a fracture that sent pain lancing through the left side of his skull. Izuku reset his jaw with a wet pop. The crack sealed in 2 seconds. He looked back at Muscular. "Is that your maximum?" he asked. Muscular roared. The sound was more animal than human, pure, violent joy from a creature that existed to hit things and break them. He swung again. A straight right, then a left hook. Then an overhead that came with his full body weight behind it, the augmented arm tripling in mass mid-swing. Each blow connected. Each blow rocked Izuku's frame. His feet slid on the stone. His bones cracked and healed and cracked again. But Izuku wasn't backing up anymore. He hit back. One punch. His right fist, armored to the knuckle with bone protrusions that had sharpened in response to the combat, drove into the center of Muscular's augmented arm. The dense fiber compressed under the impact. The internal structure of the augmentation caved inward. Muscular's arm collapsed at the midpoint, and the villain screamed, not in pain, in fury, in the rage of something that refused to acknowledge it had met its superior. Muscular augmented further. His quirk pushed past its standard ceiling, fiber erupting from every limb, his torso swelling, his remaining eye socket filling with overflow material that bulged grotesquely. He doubled in size, then tripled. He was a tower of compressed meat with a man's rage driving it. He charged. Izuku planted his feet. The collision shattered the rock shelf beneath them. The cliff edge gave out. They fell 15 meters to the forest floor below, locked together, trading blows the entire way down. Muscular's augmented fists hammered Izuku's ribs. Izuku's bone-armored hands drove into the villain's swelling mass. Each impact was a detonation. The air between them compressed and released in waves. They hit the ground and the crater was immediate. 3 meters wide, the earth displaced in a circle around the impact. Izuku was on top, his hand pressed flat against Muscular's chest. Fret, the villain pushed back. Augmentation surging. Enormous pressure building beneath Izuku's palm. Izuku's arm shook. The bone plating on his hand thickened in real time, layer by layer, adapting to the compression force. Muscular pushed harder. Izuku's adaptation compounded. The math was running. The outcome was predetermined. Muscular's augmentation had a ceiling. His body could only produce so much fiber, could only pack it so dense. Izuku's adaptation had no ceiling that anyone had found. Izuku pressed down. Muscular's augmentation hit its limit. Izuku's strength kept climbing. Muscular went still. His augmentation deflated. His eyes rolled. The enormous muscle mass that covered his frame deflated like a balloon losing air, leaving a normal-sized man pinned beneath a bone-armored hand that could have gone through his chest and chose not to. Izuku stood. He pulled capture tape from his belt, standard hero equipment he'd carried since the license briefing, and bound Muscular's limbs. Then he went back up the cliff to get Kota. The boy was conscious now, staring at Izuku with eyes that held too much for someone so young. The same eyes Izuku recognized from his own mirror at 13. The eyes of someone who had learned early that the world was not safe. "You're okay," Izuku said. He knelt. His voice dropped to the softest register it could reach. The low rasp gentled into something approaching warmth. "I've got you." Kota looked at the bone ridges, at the blood on Izuku's knuckles that wasn't his, at the forest burning behind them. He didn't speak, but when Izuku reached out, the boy grabbed his hand and held on and didn't let go. Blue flame hit Izuku's back as he carried Kota through the forest toward the main cabin. The heat was different from standard fire. Higher temperature, burning blue-white instead of orange, hot enough to incinerate standard flesh in seconds. Cremation. Dabi's quirk. Izuku felt it land on his back and felt the temperature register above his existing fire immunity. For exactly 12 seconds, it hurt. Not the searing agony of the factory, nothing would ever be that again, but a sharp, intense awareness of heat beyond what his current resistance covered. His cells fired. The adaptation ran. Blue flame resistance encoded. His skin at the impact point reddened, then sealed, then lightened to its standard scarred white. He turned around. Dabi stood between 2 burning trees. Dark hair, blue eyes, a lean frame wrapped in a costume that bore old burn scars. His hands were wreathed in blue flame, and his expression carried the detached amusement of someone watching a science experiment. "Different color," Izuku said. His voice was flat. Same result. Dabi's expression shifted just slightly, the amusement draining, replaced by something harder. He fired again, a concentrated beam of blue flame aimed at Izuku's chest. It hit. It broke around him like water around a stone. His skin didn't even register it as warmth anymore. Dabi lowered his hands. He looked at Izuku, at the bone-armored, fire-immune, unburnable wall holding a child against his chest, and said nothing. He stepped backward into the smoke and vanished. Izuku didn't chase him. The priority was the camp, the students. Finding Bakugo before the thought came 60 seconds too late, he burst into the western clearing at full sprint and found it empty. Torn earth, blast marks from explosions that had been aimed at targets no longer present. And at the center of the clearing, a marble on the ground, the signature of a compression quirk. Mr. Compress. Izuku had studied the League's roster. He knew what that marble meant. The portal opened 30 meters ahead. Black and purple fog, Kurogiri's warp gate, edges solidifying as the remaining squad members converged on it. Izuku saw them entering. Toga, Dabi, a figure with a lizard mutation, and he lunged for the portal. His fist punched through fog. His fingers closed on nothing. The warp contracted around the edges of his arm, and he felt the space-folding pressure of it trying to close, trying to sever. But his arm was inside, and the fog couldn't cut through bone armor. And for one moment he was caught between the two sides of reality, with his hand reaching for something already gone. The portal collapsed. His arm was still attached. The closing force hadn't been enough. But the clearing was empty, and the night was full of burning, and Bakugo was gone. Izuku stood in that clearing for 10 seconds. He did not perform grief. He did not rage at the sky or punch the earth or scream into the smoke. He stood with his arm still extended, his fingers still closed around nothing, and he processed what had happened with the focus of someone who was already calculating the next step. Bakugo was gone. The person who had killed Izuku at 13, the person who had spent 2 years carrying that weight, who had just begun to channel it into something that looked like growth, was in the hands of the League of Villains. The complexity of what Izuku felt about this was tangled and layered and impossible to reduce to a single emotion. He cared about Bakugo, not in the way you care about a friend, but in the way you care about someone who is bound to you by a shared event that altered both of you permanently. And that person was now in danger because Izuku had been 60 seconds too late. He turned and went back to the camp. He protected who remained. He carried Koda to the medical staging area and stood guard while the emergency responders arrived and the flames were beaten back and the head count was taken and the single absence was confirmed. Momo found him at the edge of the perimeter, his bone protrusions still extended, his body still in combat configuration, his eyes tracking the tree line for threats that had already left. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "It's not your fault." She stood beside him and pressed her shoulder against his arm and said, "We'll get him back." He looked at her. The firelight from the distant burning reflected off his bone ridges. "Yes," he said, "we will." The pro-hero raid on the League's hideout was coordinated in 48 hours. Best Jeanist, Matt Lady, Tiger, Gang Orca, a coalition of top 10 heroes assembled with tactical precision, armed with intelligence from a tracking device Momo had created and planted on a Nomu during the forest attack. She hadn't told anyone she'd done it until after the battle. When she presented the tracker data to Aizawa, his expression didn't change, but he looked at her for a long time before saying, "Well done." The students were told to stay at UA told, not asked. The distinction was important to Aizawa, who stood in front of Class 1A and said at once, "This is a professional operation. You are students. Stay here." Izuku listened to the instruction. He processed it. He weighed it against the calculation his body was built for, the assessment of where his presence tipped the odds in ways that his absence made worse. The math was clear. He went. Momo went with him. Todoroki, Kirishima, Ida. They moved as a unit, coordinated by Momo's tracking data, navigating the city at night, converging on the League's position from a different angle than the pro-hero assault team. Not interfering. Not replacing. Supplementing. The hideout was a converted warehouse in the industrial ward of Kamino. The pro-heroes breached the outer walls at 10:47 p.m. Izuku's group reached the perimeter at 10:52. They felt the concussive force of the initial engagement through the pavement, heroes clashing with League members inside, the building shaking with each exchange. And then the air changed. Something arrived that wasn't part of any tactical plan. Something that didn't enter the building so much as it became apparent that it had always been there. Waiting, sitting in the dark, patient in the way that only something truly ancient in its power could be patient. All for one. The building's east wall exploded outward. Best Jeanist flew through the opening, unconscious, his fiber quirk unraveled, his body limp. He hit the street and slid 30 meters. Mount Lady staggered from the breach, blood on her face, her gigantification dropping as her consciousness wavered. Tiger stumbled behind her, his arm at a wrong angle. The heroes were losing. All for one walked out of the building through the breach he had made with their bodies. He was large, physically imposing in a way that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with presence. His face was a ruin of scar tissue and medical equipment, the eyes gone, replaced by sensors that read the world in ways normal vision couldn't. His voice was rich, unhurried. The voice of someone who had built empires and outlived them. "Heroes," he said, looking at the fallen pros without his eyes. Always so eager, always so fragile. Izuku felt it from the perimeter. Not strength, he'd felt strength before. Muscular was strength. The Nomu was strength. All might was strength. This was different. This was gravity, the sense of something at the center of the world pulling everything toward it. A presence that didn't announce itself so much as it made everything else feel smaller by existing in the same space. All Might arrived. The sky cracked with the speed of his descent. He landed between All for One and the fallen heroes with enough force to crater the street. His hero form blazed, muscles straining, cape streaming, smile fixed in the way it was always fixed when cameras might be watching and the world needed to see that its symbol was still standing. "You won't touch them again," All Might said. "Ah," All for One tilted his head. "There you are. I wondered when you'd come." The fight between them was enormous. It was the fight the world had been waiting for without knowing it. The clash that existed at the center of hero society, like a fault line that everyone knew would eventually rupture. All Might versus All for One. The light and the shadow. The symbol and the thing that had spent generations trying to destroy what symbols meant. They traded blows that collapsed buildings for a block in every direction. Air pressure from their exchanges shattered every window within 100 meters. The ground beneath them fractured and reformed and fractured again. All Might hit with everything the embers of One for All could generate. All for One combined quirks in layers, air cannon and force enhancement and recoil multiplier stacked together into techniques that hit like natural disasters. All Might was losing. Not all at once. Not in a single blow. But the strain of maintaining his hero form was burning through his reserves faster than he could replenish them. Each hit he took cost more than the last. Each hit he landed accomplished less against All for One's stacked defenses. The math was running. The outcome was approaching. Izuku moved. He broke from the perimeter at full sprint. Momo reached for him. Her hand caught the back of his jacket, and she felt the fabric slip through her fingers as he accelerated beyond her grip. Izuku. He was already gone. The street between the perimeter and the battle was 400 meters of destroyed pavement and collapsed debris. Izuku covered it in 3 seconds. He burst into the engagement zone at a velocity that split the air behind him, his bone protrusions deploying mid-stride, his frame expanding into full combat configuration. All Might saw him. Young Midoriya. No. Izuku didn't stop. All for One turned. He assessed instantly, completely, without visible reaction. His sensors swept across Izuku's form. His head tilted 1 degree. "Interesting," All for One said. "You're not a quirk. You're an event." He fired, air cannon fused with force enhancement, fused with recoil multiplier. The combined technique was a focused beam of compressed force. Enough raw kinetic output to level a city block. It hit Izuku full in the chest at point-blank range. Izuku flew. His body punched through the exterior wall of the warehouse and hit the street on the far side in a rolling crater that displaced asphalt in every direction. He carved a trench 40 meters long before he stopped. He was in the crater for 3 seconds. The bone armor on his chest had cracked. Not broken, cracked. Lines running through the plating like fissures in rock after an earthquake. He could feel the adaptation beginning. His cells racing to understand the force signature, to categorize it, to build the response. Stacked quirk force interactions, multiple simultaneous quirk attacks compounding. His cellular structure was learning. He got up. All for One watched him get up. For the first time in this story, for the first time in what might have been decades, All for One showed surprise. The expression was small, brief, a slight pause in the rhythm of his movements, a microsecond of recalculation. But it was there. Izuku charged back. He was not going to defeat All for One. He understood this the way he understood his own heartbeat, as a fact that lived beneath strategy. All for One was too fast, too varied, too experienced. His arsenal was so wide that Izuku's adaptation couldn't keep pace when the attack types changed every 2 seconds. Kinetic force, thermal pulse, electrical discharge, gravitational compression. Each one a different quirk, each one deployed in combination with others, each one forcing Izuku's body to split its adaptive resources across multiple fronts. What Izuku did was absorb. He took hit after hit, air cannon to the chest, force enhancement to the shoulder, a quirk that accelerated molecular vibration until his skin threatened to shake apart, and his cells adapted, locking his molecular structure against vibrational disruption. A quirk that attempted to compress his skeleton inward, and his bones responded, growing denser, pushing outward. Each attack that landed made him more resistant. Each quirk that touched him became less effective on the second hit. He was not fighting All for One to win. He was fighting All for One to buy time. All Might needed seconds, moments, the chance to gather every remaining ember of One for All into a single point without taking another hit while he did it. Izuku was giving him those seconds by being the target that couldn't die. All for One realized it. His sensors swept from Izuku to All Might and back. He understood the game. He turned from Izuku, dismissing him as the distraction he was, and drove a combined technique into All Might's chest that sent the symbol of peace through two buildings. Two buildings. All Might's hero form broke. It didn't flicker. It dropped. The transformation shattered like glass around the thin, emaciated body beneath. The skeletal man stood in the rubble in his oversized costume, exposed, diminished, utterly human in every way that mattered. Cameras were everywhere, civilian phones, media drones. Every screen in Japan received that image simultaneously. All Might's true form revealed. The country gasped. All Might stood in the rubble, thin, broken, bleeding from 7 places. His left arm hung useless, his legs trembled, but his right arm rose, his right fist clenched. The last embers of One for All ignited in that fist, not a flame anymore, barely a spark, but every photon of it gathered into one final point. One for All Might whispered. Then louder, United States of Smash. The punch hit All for One. The impact split the air for a kilometer in every direction. The force pushed through All for One's stacked defenses like they were nothing. The cumulative weight of every wielder of One for All channeled through a single dying ember into a single strike. All for One's body took the full force. His defensive quirks failed in sequence. He flew backward, and the impact at the end was his own small apocalypse. The ground cratering, the buildings behind him collapsing, his body caught by the reinforcements that had been waiting for this exact moment. The restraints came. The containment, the specialized prison transport. All for One was not destroyed. He was too old, too durable, too prepared for that. But he was defeated, contained. And the man who had done it stood in the rubble with nothing left. All Might raised his arm, one finger pointed at the camera. His thin skeletal face was gaunt and bloodied and entirely honest for the first time in decades. He said it to every screen in Japan. It's your turn. Then his arm dropped, and he collapsed, and the world rushed in to catch him. Izuku watched from the rubble. He was standing at full height, bone armor deployed, eyes burning, his body radiating the heat shimmer of recent adaptation. The contrast was a photograph that would define an era, the old symbol falling, and behind him something new rising. Something made of bone and fire and the refusal to stay down. Momo pushed through the press of heroes and emergency personnel. She found him by the heat shimmer, the distortion in the air that marked his location like a beacon. She stopped 2 meters from him and looked at his face, and he looked at hers, and neither of them said anything heroic or profound. He's alive, she said, I know. And so are you. I know that too. She leaned against his arm, the bone ridge on his shoulder, pressed against the side of her head, and she settled into it the way she always did, finding the groove, fitting against the monster's frame with the comfort of someone who had long since stopped seeing the monster. Around them, the world was loud and broken and massive. Cameras flashing, heroes being loaded into ambulances. Civilians at the perimeter crying and cheering and filming. The government already mobilizing response teams. The media already crafting the narrative. But at the center of it, at the exact center where the 2 epicenters of destruction overlapped, 2 people stood together and knew exactly where they stood. That was enough. In the noise and the aftermath and the enormity of what had just happened, that was enough. The provisional hero license exam took place 6 weeks after Camino. The world was different. All Might's retirement had opened a vacuum in hero society that nothing had filled. Agency rankings were in flux. Public confidence was shaken. The commission was restructuring. New protocols, new classifications, new frameworks for a world that no longer had its SLEC symbol. In the middle of all this, first-year UA, students filed applications for their provisional licenses. Izuku's application triggered a secondary review. The commission officer who received it, a senior woman named Yokomizo who had worked the bureau for 20 years, looked at the quirk type field and found it blank. She pulled the file. She read it. Then she convened a panel. 7 people sat in a government conference room and reviewed the USJ footage, the sports festival data, the Hosu incident report, the Camino perimeter recordings. They discussed classification. They discussed threat designations. They discussed whether reactive evolution constituted a Category Omega classification under protocols written after the original All for One arrest. The debate ran for 3 hours. Then, Momo Yaoyorozu was called to testify. She walked into the commission hearing in full internship dress, her posture perfect, her expression composed, a bound report of 47 pages in her hands. She addressed the panel for 12 minutes. She did not raise her voice once. She explained the adaptive mechanism, the threshold requirements, the cellular encoding process, the immune response analogy. She presented data on his resting state versus combat state. She showed the metabolic profiles. She walked them through the progression from fire immunity, through kinetic resistance, through blade immunity, through quirk toxin metabolism. Then, she said something that wasn't in her report. His power's response pattern is defensive, she said. It is triggered by threat, not initiated by aggression. Reactive evolution grows stronger precisely when the people it protects are in the most danger. It is, by every metric I can identify, the most hero-aligned quirk in the current registry. The panel sat with this. One member, an older man with a transformation quirk that gave him stone skin, leaned forward. And if the threat is to himself alone, without anyone to protect, Momo didn't hesitate. Then his body adapts and survives. That is also heroic. Survival is not a crime. Thus, the panel approved his license. After the hearing, one member said to a colleague in the hallway, "She made it sound like he's built to protect people." The colleague, the stone-skinned man, looked back at the hearing room door and said, "He is." The exam itself was held at a massive testing facility outside the city. Hundreds of students from multiple schools, all first and second years, all competing for provisional authority. The format was two-phase, combat qualification followed by rescue operations. The other schools had prepared for Class 1A. The sports festival footage was public. Every student with a screen had watched Izuku Midoriya walk through fire and ice and come out unchanged. Strategy meetings had been held. Plans had been made. The plan was simple. Eliminate the strongest target first. Combine firepower. Overwhelm with numbers. 20 students hit Izuku simultaneously from 4 directions in the opening 30 seconds of the combat phase. The assault was impressive. Energy quirks, projectile quirks, area denial quirks all firing in overlapping patterns. The impact zone was spectacular. Smoke, light, concussive waves radiating outward. The ground at Izuku's position cratered and the air filled with dust and debris, and the combined output of 20 teenagers who had trained for this moment specifically. Izuku stepped out of the smoke, completely unharmed. His uniform was dusty. His bone protrusions had extended slightly, the standard alert response. But his skin was unmarked. His stride was unbroken. He looked at the 20 students, many of whom had exhausted their immediate offensive capabilities in that opening salvo, and raised one hand, an acknowledgement. Not a challenge. Not a dismissal. Just, "I see you. I'm still here." Then he walked past them toward the rescue portion of the exam and completed it in 7 minutes. He stabilized simulated civilians. He cleared debris with controlled strength. He carried 6 people simultaneously, 3 in each arm, with a gentleness that made the observers in the scoring booth update their threat assessment notes with a single word, versatile. He passed with the highest composite score in exam history. The number was posted on the results board, and students from every school stared at it and made the same face, the face of someone confronting a ceiling they hadn't known existed. Momo passed with the 3rd highest score. She found him at the exit holding his license, and her expression held no surprise, just the warm certainty of an expected outcome. "Congratulations," she said. He held up the license. The plastic card with his photo, bone ridges visible like red threading in his eyes caught by the camera flash. "I look angry in the picture." "You look like yourself," she said. "That's enough." That evening, Momo took him to the rooftop. She'd scoped the location earlier, a building near the exam facility with roof access and a view of the city stretching to the horizon. She'd created a blanket from her arm without explaining it and laid it on the concrete edge. They sat together. The city was lit below them. 1,000 windows and 10,000 lights, and the distant sound of a world going about its business. His shoulder pressed against hers. His internal heat kept the evening chill from touching her. The bone ridge on his forearm rested against her knee, and she didn't adjust. She never adjusted. "Tell me about your family," he said. She looked at him. Then at the city. Then she told him. The Yaoyorozu estate. The expectations of a lineage that produced quirks capable of world-changing applications. The weight of being the heir to that legacy, not just the name, but the standard. The tutors, the assessments, the board meetings she'd been attending since she was 12. The specific kind of loneliness that came with being brilliant and beautiful and wealthy and still feeling like no one saw you as a person rather than a portfolio. She told him all of it. Not with complaint. She spoke with the same precision she brought to everything, the data points of her life arranged in order. But underneath the precision was something real. Something tired. Something human. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the city hummed below them and the night was full and quiet, and he said, "You carry a lot for someone who spends so much time caring about what everyone else is carrying." She was silent for a long moment. Then, "No one has ever said that to me before. I'm saying it now." The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, full. Then she turned to look at him. At the bone ridges along his jaw catching the city light from below. At the scarred skin and the red threading in eyes that were softer now than they had been at any point in the day. At the face of a boy who had been built by death into something impossible and was sitting on a rooftop with her in the dark like he was just a person. She reached up and touched his face. Her fingers along the jaw ridge, the same ridge she'd touched before in the cafeteria, on the train, in quiet moments between training sessions, but slower now, warmer, with a different weight behind it. He didn't move, he barely breathed. His body, the body that adapted to every stimulus, that grew armor in response to every threat, went completely still, because this wasn't a threat. This was the opposite of a threat. This was the thing he had no armor against because he'd never needed armor against it. "I think I love you," she said. The words came out steady and direct, because she was Momo Yaoyorozu and she did not perform uncertainty. She said what she meant when she meant it, and she did not look away. He looked at her. The red in his eyes dimmed to almost nothing, the least threatening they had ever appeared. The bone protrusions on his shoulders settled to their absolute lowest state. His entire body was radiating the signal that Momo's notes would have categorized as maximum safety. Zero threat detected. "I think I've been in love with you since you asked how my bone growth responds to threat stimuli at the UA entrance exam," he said. She laughed. It was a full, bright sound, startled out of her by the specificity of it, by the absurdity and the truth of it combined. The sound of that laugh in the night air was something Izuku filed away the way his body filed away every stimulus that mattered. Permanently, irrevocably, built into the structure of what came next. He smiled. The smile was rare and it was enormous on his angular, bone-ridged face. It transformed him. The monster receding, the boy flooding forward, something genuine and young and alive in an expression that most people never got to see. She put her hand on his chest, over the bone plating, over the heart beating slow and strong beneath it, 32 beats per minute, unhurried, unbreakable. She pressed her palm flat against him and felt the warmth of his internal heat through the plating, and she stayed there. He covered her hand with his, the armored knuckles, the bone ridges along his fingers, his massive hand over her smaller one, holding it against his heart. He held it the way he held everything about her, with the absolute awareness that he was something that broke things. This he would never break. The city lights were below them. The night was above them. For a long time, neither of them said anything at all because nothing needed to be said. They sat on the edge of a rooftop with their hands together over his heart, and the world was vast and full of things that would try to destroy them both. And in this moment, none of it could reach them. The Shi Hasaikai raid was coordinated through Sir Night Eye's agency, a 6-month intelligence operation compressed into 8 weeks of preparation after the target was identified. Kai Chisaki, Overhaul, the Yakuza boss running a criminal enterprise in the shell of an old organized crime syndicate, producing a drug that could erase quirks permanently. Derived from the biology of a child named Eri, Izuku was assigned to the main assault team. The mission was extraction, get Eri out, get the drug production shut down. Contain Chisaki, the compound was underground. A labyrinth of tunnels and chambers beneath the Hasaikai's surface property. The hero team entered through a breach point and immediately the architecture became hostile. Walls shifted, floors reformed, The compound was designed to be reshaped by its master's hands. The team split. Lemillion, the third-year student whose permeation quirk made him intangible, went ahead at maximum speed. Sir Night-Eye took the tactical rear with his foresight. The mid-tier heroes took flanking positions. Izuku went through the center. The Hasaikai's soldiers, men with combat quirks and Yakuza loyalty, threw themselves at him as he moved through the tunnels. He walked through them the way he walked through everything. A fist that could have killed a normal man hit his jaw and accomplished nothing. A quirk that generated razor wire wrapped around his arm, and the wire snapped against his bone protrusions like thread against steel. He pressed forward, leaving bound and unconscious enemies behind him, his pace never slowing. He reached the inner chamber alone. The room was massive, cathedral-sized, carved from the rock beneath the compound. The ceiling was 30 meters above. The floor was stone tile. The lighting was industrial, bare fluorescent strips that cast everything in flat, shadowless white. Eri was there, chained by her wrist to a restraint post at the far end of the chamber. Her face was blank, the practiced emptiness of someone who had learned through years of abuse that expressing need or hope or fear only made things worse. She was small, fragile. Her hair was white and her eyes were red, and she looked at Izuku the way you look at something you've stopped believing in. Overhaul was there. Kai Chisaki stood at the center of the chamber with his gloves off and his hands at his sides. He was lean and sharp-featured with golden eyes above a plague doctor's beak mask. His posture was relaxed, the posture of a man who was entirely in control of his environment. He looked at Izuku, at the bone protrusions, the armored skin, the burning red eyes. He assessed it the way you assess a material, for its properties, its composition, its vulnerability. Your body is just matter arranged a particular way, Chisaki said. His voice was smooth, conversational. Interesting arrangement. Still just matter. Don't touch the girl, Izuku said. Chisaki touched the floor. The stone tiles erupted. Spikes, sharp, dense, moving at the speed of thought, launched upward from the ground in a forest of stone. They hit Izuku from every angle. One punched through the gap between his shoulder protrusions and drove into his trapezius. Another found the seam at his knee, the same gap Stain's blade had once exploited. A third drove through his palm when he raised his hand to block. He ripped the spikes from his body. The wounds sealed in seconds, each one leaving behind slightly thicker armor at the penetration point. He advanced. Chisaki reshaped the walls. Pillars of stone and metal and concrete swung inward like battering rams. Each one hit Izuku, and each one accomplished less than the last. The floor became a pit. Izuku jumped the gap. The ceiling came down. He caught it, held it, threw it aside. Chisaki was watching with the expression of a scientist observing a variable that refused to follow the expected curve. He changed approach. He didn't reshape the environment. He ran at Izuku. His hands were out, bare skin, fingers spread, palms reaching. The intent was clear, direct contact. If he could touch him, he could take him apart at the molecular level. He could disassemble the matter that Izuku Midoriya was made of and choose not to reassemble it. Izuku met him head-on. His bone-armored fist swung. Chisaki dodged, fast, trained, his body moving with the precision of someone who had practiced combat alongside his quirk work. He ducked the punch and his hand slapped against Izuku's extended forearm. The deconstruction began instantly. Izuku felt it. His forearm, the bone armor, the scarred skin, the dense muscle beneath came apart, not destroyed, disassembled. The cells separating from each other at the fundamental level, the connective tissue dissolving, the bone fragmenting into powder. His arm ceased to be an arm from the elbow down. He swung with the other hand. Chisaki caught his wrist, both hands now. The deconstruction spread up his arms, across his chest. The bone plating on his torso came apart, each cell releasing its bond with the cells around it, the structure that made him solid dissolving into a cloud of biological matter. Izuku tried to pull free. His legs were going. The deconstruction was total, moving through him like a wave, consuming everything it touched. His spine came apart, his skull, his heart. He felt the moment his brain ceased to be a brain, a flash of white, then nothing. Izuku Midoriya was gone, not dead. Gone, dispersed, deconstructed at the cellular level into constituent biological matter, amino acids and minerals and water, and nothing that resembled a person. The cloud of what he had been drifted across the chamber floor like fine dust in slow motion. Eri was screaming, a raw, tearing sound from a child who had watched this happen to other people and knew what it meant. Chisaki stepped back. He looked at what he had done, the absence where the boy had been. Nothing on the floor, nothing in the air, no bones, no blood, no body. "See?" he said. His voice was even. "Just matter." He reached for Eri. The matter moved. It started at the center of the dispersed cloud. A pull like magnetism, like gravity, like something that existed beneath the laws of physics deciding to assert itself. The scattered cells found each other. Every particle of what had been Izuku Midoriya turned in the air and moved, drawn to a central point by a force that Chisaki's quirk had no framework to prevent. Overhaul could take things apart and put them back together. It had never encountered something that put itself back together without permission. Bones formed first. The skeleton assembled from powder and fragment, each bone finding its partner, each joint articulating into place with a speed that accelerated as the process continued. The skull reformed with the jaw ridges already present. The spine constructed itself with the protrusions emerging mid-formation, white and sharp and longer than they had ever been. The spinal crest extending from the base of the skull to the lower back in a continuous ridge that caught the fluorescent light. The protrusions formed on the skeleton before the muscles covered it. As though whatever intelligence drove Izuku's cells had decided that the skeleton at the center of the next version of him would be a weapon before it was a frame. Muscles layered over the bone at impossible speed, red and dense and visibly larger than what had been there before. The mass was greater, the frame was wider. Each muscle group that reformed was denser, more compressed, carrying more force per fiber than its predecessor. Skin followed, crawling over the surface in a wave that started at the chest and spread outward. The pale, scarred texture was still there, but there were traceries now. White-green, bioluminescent, pulsing with each beat of the reforming heart like a circuit diagram drawn in living light. They traced the paths of cellular reconstruction, the routes the matter had traveled to reassemble itself, and they glowed. Faintly. Just barely. Just enough to see. His heart beat. Once, twice, each beat stronger than the last. His lungs filled, his eyes opened. They burned white. Not red. White. A light that poured from his eyes like something had been ignited at the core of him that was beyond anger, beyond adaptation, beyond anything the story had shown before. The white light cast his bone ridges in sharp relief, the jaw, the cheekbones, the spinal crest, the massive shoulder protrusions that now extended above his head in blade-like spires. He was larger. His frame filled the space differently. Broader, taller, the proportions of a weapon that had learned to walk upright. The bioluminescent traceries pulsed with each heartbeat. The bone armor covered him from collarbone to waist in interlocking plates. His hands were armored to the wrist, each finger tipped with bone that could cut steel. He stood. The process of going from scattered matter to standing took 11 seconds. 11 seconds of absolute silence in the chamber except for Eri's sobbing and the wet, violent sounds of a body constructing itself from nothing. Chisaki was 3 steps from Eri when the sound made him turn. He saw it. The boy. The thing. The matter he had dispersed into non-existence 11 seconds ago, standing at the center of the chamber in a form that was more than what it had been before. Glowing. Armored. Eyes burning with white light that cast shadows across the chamber walls. Chisaki's hands were still raised. The hands that had taken Izuku apart. The hands that had erased him from existence. Izuku looked at those hands. Then he looked at Chisaki's face. His voice when he spoke was lower than it had ever been. Not a growl, not a roar. Something worse. Something that communicated finality the way a door closing communicates that what's on the other side is no longer accessible. You shouldn't have done that. Chisaki moved. His quirk fired. He slapped both palms against the floor, and the stone erupted upward in a wave of restructured matter. Spikes, walls, barriers, everything the room was made of, repurposed into a fortress between himself and the thing that was walking toward him. Izuku walked through it. The stone hit him and shattered. The spikes struck his armor and broke. The walls he pushed through with outstretched hands, and they crumbled like wet clay against the force. Each step he took cracked the floor. Each barrier that failed made the next one more pointless. Chisaki was building walls, and Izuku was destroying them by existing in their space. Chisaki tried direct contact again. Desperate now, his golden eyes wide behind the mask, his composure cracking. He lunged, both hands reaching for Izuku's chest. The same move that had worked before, the same deconstruction attempt. Izuku caught him by both wrists. The grip closed. Chisaki's fingers were 6 inches from Izuku's chest. 6 inches. His quirk was firing. Izuku could feel the deconstruction trying to begin where Chisaki's palms faced his body, but it couldn't reach. His cells had encoded the defense. Cellular reconstruction immunity. The deconstruction signal touched his skin, and his cells read it and rejected it, and held their structure against the force that was trying to separate them. Chisaki's quirk was useless against him now. The thing that had killed him was solved, added to the list. Fire, cold, kinetic force, blades, paralysis toxins, cellular deconstruction. Each one a death he'd survived. Each one a door that could never open the same way twice. Chisaki was held in the air by both arms, his feet dangling, his mask falling, his face exposed, young, angular, the face of a man who had built his entire identity on the certainty that his hands could unmake anything, and was now suspended by his wrists in front of something his hands couldn't touch. He spoke. He threatened. He bargained. He invoked Eri, the research, the drug, the value of what he was building. He tried to reason with the white burning eyes. He said, "You don't understand what I'm doing. The drug can fix society. It can erase the chaos that quirks created. I'm saving the world." Izuku listened to all of it without changing expression. The bioluminescent traceries on his skin pulsed once, twice. Then he squeezed, both wrists, a grip that could bend rebar, applied with precise and specific intent. The sound was a double crack. Chisaki screamed, a sound ripped from somewhere deeper than pain, the sound of someone losing the tools that define their existence. Izuku set him down on the floor. The villain collapsed, his hands useless, his wrists shattered, his quirk intact, but permanently unable to make the contact required to use it. He lay on the stone tiles making sounds that weren't words. Izuku stepped over him. He walked to Eri. The small girl was pressed against the restraint post, her chain rattling from the trembling of her body, her red eyes enormous in her pale face. She had watched everything. The deconstruction, the resurrection, the fight. She was staring at Izuku with an expression that contained too much for a child to hold. He knelt. He was enormous. The bone spikes on his shoulders cast shadows over her. His white burning eyes dimmed as he lowered himself to her level, the intensity pulling back, the light softening. His bioluminescent traceries pulsed gently. His face, angular, ridged, inhuman by any standard the world used, softened into something as close to gentleness as his features could produce. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice was low, soft, the same tone, the same words, the same gentleness he had used with Momo at the entrance exam, kneeling in the dust of a fallen zero-pointer, holding a girl he'd just saved and asking if she was okay. The echo was there for anyone who knew both moments. Eri stared at him, at the white-green traceries, at the bone ridges, at the eyes that were dimming from white back toward red, at the hand, massive, armored, capable of shattering wrists with a squeeze, that rested palm up on his knee in offering rather than reaching for her. She looked at that hand for a long time. Then she reached out and pressed her small palm against the bone plating on his chest. The same instinct, the same gesture that Momo had made, that seemed to be the universal language for, "Pues, I see what you are and I'm not afraid." "You came back," Eri said. Her voice was tiny, barely there. He put his hand over hers. The armored fingers dwarfed her entire hand. He held it there against his heart, the heart that had stopped and started and stopped and started and would keep starting as long as there were people who needed him standing. "I always come back," he said. He broke her chain with a single motion, his fingers closing around the restraint cuff and crumpling it like aluminum foil. She was free. She looked at her wrist, raw and red from years of confinement, and then she looked at him, and something in her face changed. Something that had been locked behind practiced blankness for years cracked open, and her eyes filled with tears, and she reached for him with both arms. He picked her up. She was impossibly light, the weight of nothing against his frame. She grabbed the bone spike on his shoulder and held on and pressed her face against his neck and cried. Small, shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. Izuku held her. He wrapped both arms around her, bone protrusions angled away, hands flat against her back, the same hold he used with Momo. The hold of something that breaks everything, carrying something breakable with absolute care. He walked out of the compound carrying her, through the tunnels, past the bound enemies, past Mirio, who had been fighting through the upper levels and arrived at the inner chamber entrance just in time to see Izuku emerging with a child in his arms and a bioluminescent glow fading from his skin. Past Sir Night-Eye, who looked at Izuku and then at his forearm, the forearm his foresight had shown him a death he could not prevent, and found no words. He walked out into daylight. The raid team was at the surface. Pro-heroes, police, medical personnel. They all turned when he emerged. Eri was asleep against his shoulder. Her hand was still wrapped around his bone spike. Her face was peaceful in a way it hadn't been in years. Momo was at the perimeter. She had coordinated support logistics from the surface, communication equipment, tracking data, medical supply creation for the responding teams. When Izuku walked out of the compound, she saw him from 50 meters away and started running. She reached him. She saw Eri sleeping against his shoulder. She saw the new bone plating, the spinal crest, the bioluminescent traceries that pulsed with each heartbeat. She saw that he was different again, larger, more armored, more evolved. Changed by another death she hadn't been there to witness. She didn't ask what happened underground. She would ask later, when it was quiet, when the debrief was done and the reports were filed. For now, she just stood beside him and put her hand on the arm that wasn't holding Eri and said, "She's safe." "She's safe," he confirmed. They stood there in the afternoon light. The boy who had been scattered into nothing and rebuilt himself from his own cells, the girl who understood his biology better than anyone alive, and the child sleeping against his shoulder who had reached for a monster and found something worth holding. The Paranormal Liberation War announced itself across 6 cities simultaneously. The merged force, the League of Villains fused with the Meta Liberation Army under Shigaraki's command, deployed with a coordination that overwhelmed the hero response infrastructure within the first hour. Nomu, lesser versions, mass-produced, hit population centers as distraction. Ground forces seized communication towers and transportation hubs. And at the center of it all, Shigaraki moved with purpose toward a single objective, demonstrating that the age of heroes was over. He was different. Izuku could feel it through the intelligence reports, through the footage, through the seismic data that the Hero Coordination Center was receiving in real time. Shigaraki had been remade, all for one. From prison, through proxies and plans laid years before his capture, had successfully transferred his core power. Shigaraki now carried the ability to steal and distribute quirks layered on top of his original decay. He was no longer the scratching, uncertain young man from the USJ portal. He was the next version of something ancient and terrible. The heroes mobilized. Every available pro, every agency in the country, UA students were told to remain on campus. The instruction was given by Aizawa with the same flat delivery he always used. Stay here. Izuku was on the transport bus to the front lines within the hour. Aizawa saw him bored. The underground hero's expression didn't change. He said nothing. He turned back to his briefing materials and the bus pulled away from campus, and neither of them acknowledged what both of them knew. The instruction had been given for the record, and reality operated on a different protocol. The main assault targeted the Liberation Front's headquarters, a converted industrial complex on the coastal plain that had been fortified into a military installation. Hero teams hit it from 4 directions. The engagement was immediate and total, combat on every level, in every corridor. Heroes and villains clashing in the kind of chaotic close-quarters warfare that favored numbers and sacrifice over individual power. Izuku went through the front entrance. The Liberation soldiers who met him were strong, trained, motivated with quirks that had been developed for combat use. Some had enhancement types. Some had ranged types. Some had environmental manipulation. None of them mattered. Izuku moved through the hallways like the hallways were designed for him. Man with a hardening quirk blocked his path. Izuku's fist went through the hardening and the man and the wall behind both of them. A woman with a kinetic redirection quirk tried to bounce his momentum back at him. His mass was too great, his force too constant, and she was pushed backward on her heels until she hit the far wall. A team of 6 with coordinated attack patterns hit him from every angle simultaneously. He took all 6 strikes, turned in a circle, and put each of them down with a single blow, each in the span of 2 seconds. He reached the central structure. Gigantomachia was there, the Liberation Front's ultimate weapon. 3 stories tall, a walking disaster with skin harder than steel and strength that exceeded the Nomu's by orders of magnitude. It was rampaging through the hero positions, shrugging off attacks from multiple directions, its massive form creating destruction by the simple act of moving. Izuku ran at it. The building gave out beneath him. The floor, weakened by the combat by explosions and quirk damage and structural failure, collapsed. He was mid-stride over a 60-meter open drop. No surface, no wall. Nothing to push from, his legs fired anyway. The force that had always driven his leaps, the explosive output from thigh muscles rebuilt beyond human specification, activated in a way it never had before. Not downward, not against a surface, in every direction simultaneously. An omnidirectional thrust that his body generated from itself, pushing against the air, against gravity, against the concept of falling. He went up, not fast, not clean. The initial lift was violent, a lurching upward thrust that made his bone spikes rattle and his spine crack with the force redirection. But he was rising. His body understood what it was doing before his brain caught up. The adaptation was structural. His leg muscles reconfiguring in real time, the force generation patterns shifting from the push-off format to something continuous, something sustainable. He hovered, 40 meters off the ground, his bone protrusions trailing faint heat shimmer, his eyes burning red in the dust-filled air. He looked down at his feet, at the nothing beneath them, and felt the force holding him there like a second heartbeat. Below, Momo was watching. She held a tactical command position at the rear of the hero formation, creating equipment, directing communication, keeping the coordinated teams linked across fronts. She was not passive support. She was working faster and harder than any logistic operator on the field, producing shields and weapons and medical supplies in a continuous flow that kept the hero line intact. But when the building collapsed and Izuku went through the floor, she'd looked up. She'd watched. She saw him hover. She saw his face, the expression of someone who had just discovered something about themselves that changed the shape of everything going forward. Then he flew into Gigantomachia's back. The impact was catastrophic. His body hit the massive creature at full flight velocity. Bone spikes leading, weight and speed compounding into a force that drove into Gigantomachia's shoulder blade like a launched projectile. The creature staggered. 3 stories of muscle and bone lurching sideways from the hit. Izuku pulled back. Rose, hit again from above, a diving strike that cratered the top of Gigantomachia's skull. The creature roared, a sound that shook the windows of every building still standing, and swung a massive fist upward. Izuku dodged in the air. Not gracefully, jerky, overcorrected, his flight control still developing, but enough. The fist passed beneath him, and he came down again. Another hit. Another crater in the creature's armored hide. 3 hits. 4. 5. Gigantomachia was enormous and durable beyond anything short of Izuku's adapted state, but it was being beaten down by something that could hit it from every angle and never had to land to do so. On the 6th strike, the creature's legs buckled. On the 7th, it fell. The impact of Gigantomachia hitting the ground was its own small earthquake. Heroes at the perimeter stumbled. Dust rose in a cloud that obscured the sky. When it cleared, the creature was down, conscious but defeated. Its regeneration struggling to keep up with the accumulated damage. Izuku hovered above it. His bone protrusions were fully extended, the spinal crest prominent, the shoulder spikes catching the overcast light. He was breathing hard, not from exhaustion, but from the intensity of the flight adaptation still settling into his neural pathways. He landed. Shigaraki appeared. Not from a portal, not from the building. He walked out of the dust cloud at the edge of the battlefield like he'd been watching the entire time. His appearance had changed since the USJ. The pale hair was longer, his frame was larger, his face carried new lines that belonged to the surgery and the power transfer and the transformation into something that shared space with All for One's legacy. He still scratched at his neck, but the movement had changed. It wasn't anxiety anymore. It was satisfaction. The movement of someone who knew what they were and had stopped fighting it. He looked at Izuku. Izuku looked at him. Shigaraki touched the ground. Decay spread in every direction, a wave of disintegration that turned the earth to powder, that dissolved concrete and steel and soil into gray nothing. It moved at the speed of contact, spreading outward from Shigaraki's palm in an expanding circle that consumed everything it touched. Heroes scattered. The ground beneath their feet was disappearing. Buildings at the edge of the wave collapsed into their own foundations as the structural support crumbled to dust. The devastation was absolute within the radius. Nothing survived contact with decay at this output. The wave reached Izuku. It touched his feet. His boots dissolved. The gray disintegration touched his skin and his cells felt it. The signal that said, "Come apart, dissolve," ceased to be structured matter. His cells read it. His cells responded. The decay reached his ankles and stopped. His cellular structure locked. Every cell bound to every other cell with a density that refused the dissolution signal. The decay washed over his feet like water over a stone, present, touching, unable to affect. He stood in the center of a field of dust that used to be a building, completely intact. Shigaraki watched from 50 meters away. His face, the face that used to be expressive with frustration and rage, went still. "You adapt," Shigaraki said, "even to me." "Try again," Izuku said. His voice was flat, final. Shigaraki's eyes narrowed. Then something like a smile crossed his face, thin, humorless, carrying the weight of recognition. "Especially to you," Izuku added. Shigaraki pulled his hand from the ground. The decay wave stopped expanding. He straightened. He looked at Izuku across the gray wasteland between them, the boy-shaped thing that was immune to his primary weapon, that flew, that grew armor, that came back from everything the world threw at it. "Not today," Shigaraki said. He retreated. Into the chaos, into the smoke and the fighting and the multi-front war that was still raging in every direction. He wasn't running. He was choosing when. The final fight between them would happen on his terms, in his space, at the time he selected. Izuku let him go. The priority was the current battle, the heroes who needed the front held, the civilians who needed evacuation, the liberation soldiers still fighting. He flew back into the engagement and spent the next 4 hours dismantling the enemy's position piece by piece until the sun went down and the Hero Coordination Center declared the main front secured. After the battle, Momo found him in the rubble of the headquarters. She was covered in dust. Her tactical gear was dented in 3 places from debris impacts she'd created shields against just barely in time. She had dark circles under her eyes and her hair had come free of its ponytail, and she looked at him with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment through hours of chaos and coordination and the specific kind of fear that came from knowing the person you loved was somewhere in the fighting and you couldn't be beside them. "You're flying," she said. "Apparently. How does it feel?" He thought about it. The feeling, the force generation that asked nothing from the ground, the freedom of movement in 3 dimensions, the way his body had solved a problem it didn't know it had until it needed to. "Like something that was always supposed to happen," he said, "and I just needed to fall far enough to figure it out." She looked at him with the expression she reserved for things he said that she was not prepared for. The expression that lived between intellectual fascination and emotional depth and something private that belonged to the space between them. She took his hand. Her fingers threaded between his bone-ridged knuckles, the gesture that had started on a morning train and been repeated 100 times since, each time carrying more weight, more history, more certainty. "Don't fall anymore," she said. He looked at their hands together, at the armored knuckles and the bioluminescent traceries pulsing against her skin where they touched. He said, "I'll try." Shigaraki chose a coastal city. 3 weeks after the war's main front fell, a section of the urban coastline simply ceased to exist. The decay wave hit at midnight, spreading from a single point of contact through the street grid, dissolving a 12-block radius into gray powder. Buildings, cars, roads, everything within the zone was gone by the time the first emergency responders reached the perimeter. No casualties. The area had been evacuated by anonymous tip 6 hours prior. Shigaraki wanted the stage, not the bodies. He wanted a field where nothing existed except him and the thing he'd come to destroy. Izuku received the coordinates through the Hero Coordination Network. The message was simple. He's waiting for you. He went alone. Momo tried to stop him. She was at the UA Coordination Center when the alert came through, still operating as tactical support for the ongoing cleanup operations, and she turned from her console and looked at him and said, "No." He looked at her. The bioluminescent traceries on his skin were pulsing, the slow, steady rhythm of a body at rest that knew it was about to be at war. His bone protrusions were shifting, the subtle extension of pre-combat awareness. "I have to," he said. "You don't have to go alone. He's waiting for me specifically. If anyone else is there, he'll destroy the stage with them on it." He stepped closer. His hand found her face, those armored fingers against her cheek, the bone ridges pressing against her skin with the gentleness that was always his default when he touched her. "I'll come back." Her jaw tightened. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with the intensity of someone fighting the impulse to create a tracking device and bolt it to his spine. "You always say that. I'm always right." She grabbed his hand, held it against her face, pressed her lips to his palm, to the scarred, armored skin, to the bone ridge at the base of his thumb, and held there for a moment that carried everything she couldn't say in words that would be adequate. Then she let go. She turned back to her console. Her hands were shaking as she began creating communication equipment, backup trackers, emergency beacons, medical supplies staged at the coastal perimeter. Izuku flew to the coast. The wasteland was gray and flat and silent. Former streets marked only by the powder they'd become. Former buildings indicated by nothing. The ocean was visible at the far edge, dark water meeting gray shore in a line that stretched to the horizon. The sky was overcast. The air smelled like nothing, the absence of organic matter in every direction. Shigaraki stood at the center of it. He was alone. His appearance had completed its transformation, the last traces of the young man from the USJ replaced by something that wore power like a second skin. His frame was broader, his hair was longer. The hand that used to cover his face was gone, replaced by nothing. His features exposed, his red eyes steady and clear. He saw Izuku descend. He watched the bone-armored figure lower itself from the overcast sky, spinal crest catching the dim light, bioluminescent traceries pulsing, eyes burning red. The air around Izuku shimmered with his internal heat. "You came," Shigaraki said. Izuku landed. His feet touched the powder and the impact sent it billowing outward in a ring. He stood straight. His full height, 185 centimeters of evolved biology, armored and luminescent and burning with the accumulated adaptations of every death and every pain the world had inflicted. "You knew I would?" Izuku said. Shigaraki's hands flexed at his sides. All 5 fingers on each hand spreading, the muscles in his forearms tensing. "I've been thinking about you," he said, "about what you are. You adapt to everything. You survive everything. You come back from everything. It's the most interesting problem I've ever had." He touched the ground. Decay spread at maximum radius, not a wave, an explosion. The gray dissolution expanding in every direction at running speed, eating the already powdered surface deeper, going down to bedrock, eroding the very foundation of the coastline. It hit Izuku's feet and washed past without effect. He was immune. He'd been immune since the war. Shigaraki smiled. Thin. Knowing. I expected that. He fired the stockpiled quirks all-for-one's arsenal, deployed through Shigaraki's body with a fluency the original wielder had never achieved. Force quirks, air manipulation, mass augmentation, gravitational compression, thermal overload, electrical discharge. 10 quirks in 60 seconds, each one a different attack type, each one aimed at a different vulnerability, each one stacked with others in combinations designed to overwhelm adaptive systems. The first 3 staggered Izuku. A force blast combined with gravitational compression drove him to one knee. An air manipulation attack that removed the oxygen from around his head made his vision blur for 2 seconds before his lungs adapted to function without external air. A mass augmentation that tried to increase his weight 100-fold met resistance from his bone structure, his skeleton straining, then locking, then compensating. The next 3 slowed him. A thermal attack in the infrared range, different from fire, targeting internal body temperature through radiation rather than combustion, made him sweat for the first time since his resurrection. An electrical quirk that disrupted his neural signals caused his right arm to go limp for 4 seconds before his nervous system rewired around the disruption. A quirk that vibrated the air at a frequency meant to rupture eardrums hit him, and his ear canals sealed with bone growth in response. The last 4 accomplished nothing. His body had been adapting through the sequence. Each new attack type processed and countered in real time, the accumulated solutions compounding. By the 10th quirk, Shigaraki's arsenal was hitting a wall that grew thicker with every impact. Izuku stood. He rolled his shoulders. The bone protrusions clicked into a tighter formation, plates locking together across his chest and back. He took a step forward. Shigaraki shifted strategy. He went environmental, targeting the ground beneath Izuku's feet rather than Izuku himself. The coastline section collapsed. Decay ate the substrate, and the powder surface gave way to open water below. A 20-meter drop to the ocean. Izuku flew. He was airborne before the water reached him. The force generation from his legs activating upward, the bone spikes on his shoulders cutting through the overcast air. He rose, oriented, dove. He came down on Shigaraki's position like a comet. The impact was enormous. The crater it produced was 20 meters wide, the powder coast displaced in a ring, the bedrock beneath cracking under the force. Shigaraki was at the epicenter. His decay fired instinctively, a pulse from his body in every direction, the dissolution wave hitting Izuku at contact range with everything Shigaraki could put behind it. The decay covered Izuku entirely. His skin, his bone armor, his eyes. For 6 seconds, the dissolution signal pressed against every cell in his body simultaneously. The full, concentrated power of Shigaraki's quirk trying to take him apart the way Overhaul had, trying to reduce him to nothing. 6 seconds of silence, of dust, of nothing visible at the impact point. Shigaraki stepped back from the dust cloud. He watched it. He waited. His red eyes were steady. His hands hung at his sides. He knew. Some part of him, the part that had fought this boy at the USJ, that had retreated from him at the war, that had studied him through informants and footage and the accumulated data of every encounter, knew what was coming. The dust moved. Izuku rose. Every adaptation he carried, fire, cold, kinetic force, blades, paralysis, cellular deconstruction, flight, quirk force distribution, decay immunity, all of it compounding simultaneously into a single physical peak. The true upper limit. The state his body saved for total war, his frame expanded. The bone protrusions reached their maximum, every surface covered in interlocking plates and spines. His shoulders carried blade-like spires that extended above his head. His forearms were fully armored to the elbow. His hands were weapons, each finger tipped with bone that tapered to cutting edges. The spinal crest ran unbroken from his skull to the base of his spine, a ridge of dense calcified growth that made his silhouette inhuman. The bioluminescent traceries blazed. Not the faint pulse of their resting state, a full-body glow that lit the powder around him in white-green light. His skin was luminescent. His bones were luminescent. The internal heat generation reached its peak, and the air around him shimmered and distorted, a heat corona that made him look like he was burning without flame. His eyes were white, pure, blazing. No red, no green, nothing but light. He looked like the end of something. Shigaraki saw this. All for one. Within Shigaraki, the lingering intelligence of the transferred power saw this. There was no calculation to run, no combination of quirks that would address what stood in front of them. There was only recognition. Shigaraki said the last words of a man who had run out of answers. "What are you?" Izuku walked toward him. Each footstep through the powder coast sent small shock waves through the ground, ripples in the surface material radiating outward from each impact. He spoke, and his voice was deeper than it had ever been, resonant with something that came from the core of him. "I protect everyone. That's it. That's all of it." He hit Shigaraki. The punch was not theatrical. There was no wind-up, no roar, no visible shockwave. It was the most pure, concentrated expression of force that Izuku's body had ever produced. Every adaptation, every death, every resurrection, every evolution channeled into a single point of contact between his bone-armored fist and Shigaraki's chest, all for one's defensive quirks fired in sequence. Shock absorption, kinetic redirection, mass augmentation used as passive shielding, impact distribution. 4 layers of defense that had stopped everything the hero system had ever thrown. Izuku's fist went through all of them. The defenses failed in series, each one engaging, reaching its limit, and breaking in the fraction of a second before the next one activated. The remaining force transferred to Shigaraki's body, his ribs compressed, his frame bent, his feet left the powder coast, he flew. The trajectory was a flat arc, 200 meters over the gray wasteland before he hit the coastal rubble at the far edge. The impact was devastating. The ground cratering around his body, the shockwave displacing the powder surface for 50 meters in every direction. He did not rise. Izuku walked toward him, the true upper limit blazing in every cell, each step absolute, each step final. He reached the crater where Shigaraki lay and looked down. The villain was breathing. Barely. His body was broken in several places, ribs fractured, collarbone cracked, his left arm at a wrong angle. The defensive quirks were offline, overwhelmed, their mechanisms burned out by the force they'd failed to handle. He was alive because Izuku had chosen him to be alive. The punch could have gone through his chest. It had gone through his defenses instead. Shigaraki looked up at the white burning figure standing over him. His red eyes were dim, consciousness fading, the pain pressing him toward blackness. But he was still there, still present, still the person who had been made into a weapon before he could choose what he wanted to be. Izuku saw this. He looked at Shigaraki, at the scratched neck, at the young face beneath the accumulated power, at the mirror held at the wrong angle. A boy who had been given nothing by the world. A boy who had been shaped by violence into violence. A boy who might have been something different if anything at all had gone differently for him. Izuku had no contempt for this. He had something closer to recognition. Something that understood what Shigaraki was because it lived next door to what Izuku might have been if the fire had burned away everything except the rage. He picked him up. Shigaraki's body was limp, unconscious now, the last thread of awareness having given way. Izuku carried him the way he'd carried Eri, the way he'd carried Kota. The armored arms holding the broken body with the same care he brought to everything, the absolute awareness that he was something that destroyed things. And this was not the time for destruction. He walked out of the wasteland carrying the man who had tried to end the world. The heroes were at the perimeter, dozens of them, all gathered at the edge of the decay zone, waiting for the fight to finish, waiting for whatever emerged from the dust. They saw him first as a glow, the bioluminescent traceries cutting through the gray overcast, a figure of light walking toward them out of nothing. Then the details resolved. The bone armor, the spinal crest, the white burning eyes, the villain in his arms, cameras were everywhere, media drones, emergency broadcast feeds. Every screen in Japan had this footage within 90 seconds. The boy, the thing, the hero, walking out of a wasteland that used to be a city, carrying the enemy, burning with a light that no one had ever seen before. The commentators were silent. This was the moment language failed. The word hero didn't fit what they were looking at, and nothing else had been invented yet to replace it. Izuku reached the perimeter. He set Shigaraki down on the ground, gently, the massive armored hands placing the unconscious villain on the asphalt, with the same care he used with Eri. He stepped back. The restraint teams moved in, specialized containment, the kind built for S-class threats. They worked quickly. Shigaraki was secured. Izuku stood at the edge of it and watched them work. His true upper limit was still active, still burning, still blazing, still making the air shimmer around him. But it was fading, slowly, the white light dimming, the bone protrusions beginning their slow retraction from maximum extension, the heat corona contracting. By the time the containment transport arrived, his eyes were back to green with red threading. His frame had settled, still larger than Part 1, still carrying the spinal crest and the bioluminescent traceries, still something that no category could contain. But the white light was gone. The monster had retreated inward. The boy was standing there, 16 years old, tired in a way that had nothing to do with stamina, looking at the sky. Momo was watching from a medical staging point 3 kilometers back. She'd refused evacuation after a minor injury. A piece of debris that had caught her during the earlier operations, nothing that her own creation of medical supplies couldn't address. She was watching the feed on a pro-hero's phone. She watched Izuku walk out of the wasteland. She watched him set Shigaraki down. She watched the light fade from his eyes and the armor settle against his body, and the boy emerge from beneath the god. Her hand was wrapped around his jacket, the one he'd left with her before walking into the final engagement. She'd been holding it since he flew to the coast. Her fingers tight in the fabric, her grip the only thing anchoring her through the hours of waiting. She held it tighter. The world processed Izuku Midoriya for weeks after the coastline. The footage replaced the USJ footage as the defining image of the post-All Might era. Analysts categorized it. Politicians debated it. Hero agencies competed to be associated with it. The Hero Commission initiated a full review of student hero protocols. International hero organizations sent inquiries. Academic journals published papers theorizing about reactive evolution without having access to Momo's data. His face was on every front page. The bone ridges, the bioluminescent traceries, the white light captured at its peak, overexposed in most footage, making him look like something divine rather than biological. The public reaction was less divided than after the USJ. He had carried the enemy out. He hadn't destroyed the city more than the battle required. He had walked back with a villain in his arms and handed him to law enforcement, and then stood there in the powder and waited for the police to do their work. The image of that, the most powerful entity in Japan, standing in the ruins of a final battle, waiting for restraints to be applied by people a fraction of his strength, was the image that settled people. It communicated something words couldn't. The power was enormous, but the person wielding it understood what restraint meant, understood the difference between strength and authority, understood that the hardest part wasn't winning the fight. It was knowing what to do after. UA's faculty met. Aizawa made a single statement. They handled it. Start planning next year. Everyone at the table either agreed or didn't say anything. Principal Nezu looked out his window at the campus, and his expression held something between pride and the specific satisfaction of a chess player whose long game pieces had moved exactly as planned. Recovery Girl called Izuku to the infirmary for a full assessment. He sat on the examination table, his weight making the reinforced frame creak, and she ran her scanners and made her notes with an expression that cycled between professional wonder and genuine exasperation. Your cellular structure has stabilized at a new baseline, she said, reading the results. The bioluminescent patterns are permanent. The spinal crest is permanent. Your height is 185 centimeters, up from 167 at the start of the school year. She checked her tablet. Heart rate rests at 32 beats per minute. Core temperature is 4 degrees above normal human range at rest. Bone density is approximately 17 times standard. She looked at him over the top of her tablet. You are, medically speaking, the most interesting patient I have ever had, and I would prefer you to stop generating new data. I'll try, he said. No, you won't. He didn't argue with this. 3 days after the coastline, Bakugo found Izuku in the compound training room at 5 a.m. The room was the same one they'd shared for months, the reinforced space with the impact pads and the barbells that Izuku went through every week, and the floor that was more patched than original material from the repeated stresses of their individual training. The fluorescent strips hummed. The morning was dark outside the narrow windows. Bakugo didn't start training. He sat against the wall. His palms were resting on his knees, not crackling, not sparking. Still. You never told anyone, he said. Izuku didn't ask what he meant. He set down the weight he'd been holding, a reinforced bar that Momo had created specifically for him, dense enough that it actually offered resistance. He looked at Bakugo. No, he said. The factory. No. Long silence. The fluorescent light hummed. Outside, the campus was beginning to lighten at the edges. Why? Bakugo said. His voice was at its lowest register, stripped of everything that usually armored it. The volume, the aggression, the performance of anger. Just the word. Just the question. Izuku thought for a long moment. He looked at the wall behind Bakugo's head. At the cracks in the plaster from impacts, both of them had contributed over months of early morning work. He thought about the factory, the fire, the silence, the skeleton in the ash, and the 10 minutes of nothing before life forced itself back into what remained. Because who you are now is more important than what you did then, Izuku said, and I wasn't going to hold what I survived over the head of someone who was trying to become better. Another long silence. Bakugo's arm came up over his eyes. His jaw worked. the muscles tightening, releasing, tightening again. The motion of someone processing something too large for the container they'd built for their emotions. He didn't cry. He wasn't built for it in the standard way. But the trembling in his jaw said everything that tears would have. "I'm going to be the greatest hero alive," Bakugo said. His voice was rough, raw, stripped to the foundation. "Not to beat you, because I owe it." Izuku looked at him for a moment. At the boy who had killed him at 13. The boy who had carried that weight for years without telling anyone, who had watched Izuku die twice more since then and rise each time more powerful, who had spent every morning in this room chasing a strength that might let him stand in the same conversation as the thing he'd accidentally created. "Good," Izuku said. One word, the simplest possible response. It contained everything. He picked up the training bar and started working. After a moment, Bakugo pushed off the wall and walked to his side of the room and started beside him. The sun was coming up outside. Neither of them said anything else. They trained in parallel until the campus woke and the hallways filled and the world moved on around them, carrying what had been said and what hadn't with the same weight. All Might found Izuku on the bleachers of UA. His outdoor training ground the following afternoon. The thin man walked carefully, his body more fragile now than it had ever been, the absence of one for all leaving him without even the baseline physical enhancement that had sustained him for decades. He climbed the bleacher steps and sat beside Izuku with the slowness of someone for whom stairs were a genuine consideration. They sat in silence for a while. The training ground was empty, afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass, the distant sounds of students on other fields carrying through the warm air. "I want to tell you something," All Might said. His voice was quieter than it used to be, not diminished, honest. The voice of a man who had finished performing and was now simply speaking. About One for All, about why I was looking for a successor, about what I thought the world needed. Izuku listened, All Might told him. The full history, the origin of the power, the lineage of wielders, the generations of inheritance, the fight against all for one that spanned a century, the weight of being the symbol, the search for someone to carry it forward. "I thought the world needed someone who carried the symbol forward," All Might said. "Someone who would represent what I represented." He paused, looked at the empty field, at the shadows lengthening across the grass. "Then I watched you. And I realized the world doesn't need a symbol anymore." Izuku looked at him. "It needs proof," All Might said. "Something that stands here and breathes and keeps getting up and doesn't ask for permission to protect people." He looked at Izuku, at the bone ridges, the bioluminescent traceries dimmed in the afternoon light, the red threading in those green eyes that held the weight of death survived and powers earned. "You're the proof. You're what people feel safe seeing in the news in the morning. Not because you look safe." A ghost of his old smile. Thin and wry and carrying the warmth of decades of heroism compressed into a single expression. "You don't." Izuku almost laughed. "But because when they see you," All Might continued, "they know whatever is coming has to come through you first, and nothing does that twice." The afternoon light was gold on the bleachers. The training ground stretched out before them, empty and open and full of the kind of potential that only exists in spaces designed for growth. Two men sat there, one at the end of his era, one at the beginning of his, and the distance between them was measured in something more profound than years. "I never wanted to be a symbol," Izuku said. All Might nodded. "I know. That's why you already are one." The evening after the commission review cleared him for continuo track enrollment, Izuku went to Momo's room. He had never come to her door before. In the months of their relationship, of rooftop confessions and battlefield supports and morning trains and evening conversations, it had always been her who found him. She was the one who crossed distances, who reached toward him, who closed gaps. He had let her because letting people reach for him was the hardest thing in the world for someone who had spent years watching people step away. But tonight, he went to her. He stood in the dormitory hallway in his school uniform with the collar open and the bioluminescent traceries pulsing faintly at his throat and wrists, visible in the evening light through the thin fabric. His bone ridges caught the hallway's fluorescent strips. His presence in the narrow space made the walls feel closer than they were. He knocked. She opened the door. She was in casual clothes, a sweater and leggings, her hair down around her shoulders, a tablet in her hand with what looked like a biological modeling program running on the screen. She saw him and her expression shifted. Surprise, warmth, something private and immediate. Izuku. She stepped back. Come in. Her room was organized and warm, books on every surface, a desk covered in papers and electronic equipment, a wall-mounted display showing one of her analyses mid-notation. It smelled like green tea and the subtle chemical signature of her creation quirk. He stood in the center of it and felt enormous. His frame, 185 centimeters, broad, armored, the spinal crest visible through his shirt, filled her room in a way that made the space feel like it belonged to both of them, and neither of them simultaneously. I wanted to say something, he said. She set her tablet on the desk, gave him her full attention. Her eyes, dark and warm and carrying the specific intelligence that had seen him at his most powerful and most vulnerable, met his and held. He had thought about what he wanted to say for days. He had written versions in his notebook, the analysis notebook where he kept observations about himself, where he tracked his biology and his power cycles and his emotional state markers. He had crafted sentences and discarded them, built paragraphs and torn them apart. None of them were right. The prepared version was inadequate. So he said what he actually meant. Every time something tries to kill me and fails, he said, I understand better why I want to be alive. And every version of that answer has you in it. His voice was low. The rasp of it, the voice that had been rebuilt at 13 and carried the weight of resurrection in its timbre, softened to something approaching vulnerable. You were the first person who touched the part of me that everyone else stepped away from, and you've never stopped. I don't know how to describe what that is, but I know it's the most important thing in my life. She looked at him for a long time. At the bone ridges along his jaw, the same ridges she'd touched in the cafeteria, on the train, on the rooftop. At the bioluminescent traceries pulsing at his throat like a heartbeat made visible. At the green eyes with their red threading, the eyes that had burned white during the final battle and were soft now, softer than most people knew they could be. At the boy who had died 3 times and come back as something stronger each time, and was standing in her doorway telling her she was the reason he wanted to be alive. She crossed the room. She went up slightly on her toes, the height difference requiring the adjustment, and her hands found the sides of his face, fingers against bone ridges and scarred skin and the warmth of his internal heat beneath. She kissed him. He froze for exactly 1 second. The fraction of a second it took his body to catch up with what his heart was already certain about. Then his arms came around her, careful and warm and exact, the bone protrusions on his forearms angled away from her body, his hands flat against her back. He held her the way he always held her, like she was the only thing in the world more important than the fight. She kissed him, and he kissed her back, and the room was warm from his heat, and the evening was quiet around them, and for a moment the entire world contracted to the space between their bodies, the bone armor and the soft skin, the monster and the girl who had never seen a monster. When they separated, her hands were still on his face, his hands were still on her back. They were close enough that her breath was warm on the traceries at his throat. I have 50 more pages of biological notes I haven't shown anyone, she said. He looked at her, at the warmth in her eyes, at the certainty. I'll read everyone. I know, she said. That's why I wrote them for you. The night was clear over UA. Izuku stood on the roof of the main building. The campus was quiet below him. Dormitory windows glowing, walkways empty, the distant shape of the training grounds dark under the stars. The city was lit beyond the campus walls. 1,000 windows and 10,000 lights stretching to the horizon, and beyond that the suggestion of other cities, other lights, other lives going about their business. Momo's hand was in his. They were standing at the roof's edge together. Not a dangerous edge, just the boundary between the building and the sky. The view was enormous. The night was full. His internal heat kept the air around them warm. Her fingers were threaded between his bone-ridged knuckles, the way they'd been on the morning train and every morning train since, and every rooftop and every quiet moment between the battles that defined their lives. She pressed against his arm. The bone spike on his shoulder was above her head. The bioluminescent traceries on his skin pulsed once, slow, steady, matching his heartbeat. He thought about the factory, the fire, the silence that lasted 10 minutes, the skeleton in the ash, the sound, wet and violent, of something that refused to end, the first heartbeat of his new life, the first breath, the first time he looked at his hands and saw armor where skin used to be. He thought about every death since, the Nomu snapping his neck, Stain's sword through his heart, the cold inside Todoroki's glacier, Overhaul dissolving him into nothing, each one a door he'd walked through, each one a version of himself he'd left behind, each one a proof that the world could throw everything it had at the thing he was, and the thing he was would keep getting back up. He thought about the people he'd caught, Momo under the missile, Kota against the cliff, Eri in the compound, Ida in the alley, his classmates at the USJ, the thousands of civilians who slept in their homes tonight because the thing between them and destruction was standing on this rooftop with a girl's hand in his, and no intention of ever letting the distance between him and the world grow to a size that things could slip through. He thought about Bakugo at 5 a.m., about All Might on the bleachers, about Aizawa's flat instructions and Todoroki's steady nods, and Kirishima's unashamed admiration and Tokoyami's quiet respect, about the class that had watched him die and rise and die and rise, and had never once treated him like something less than theirs. He was still a student. He was 16. He had years ahead, more fights, more growth, more people to protect, more versions of himself to become. The world would keep sending things at him. The world would keep trying to find the limit that his body refused to have, and he would keep standing, keep rising, keep being the wall between everything behind him and whatever came next. He looked out over the city. The city looked back through its windows and streetlights and the distant movement of traffic. It didn't know what he was. Exactly. It didn't have a word for it yet, but it was there. And he was there. And the distance between them was closing with every morning he woke up and went forward. Momo's thumb traced across his knuckle. The bone ridge there was smooth, worn by the months of her touching it, of her hand finding his in every kind of moment the world could produce. He looked down at her. She was looking at the city too, her expression holding something between peace and purpose. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He breathed in. The city breathed with him, the distant rhythm of a world at rest, trusting that the morning would come, trusting that whatever threatened the night would meet something on its way through. "I'm thinking this is where I'm supposed to be," he said. She looked up at him, at the bone ridges catching starlight, at the traceries pulsing their slow white-green beneath his skin, at the eyes that held the history of every death and every rising and every moment he'd chosen to stand rather than stay down. She squeezed his hand. "It is," she said. They stood there together. The night was vast and the city was lit, and somewhere below them people were sleeping and living and going about the ordinary business of existence without fear, because the thing that guarded the space between them and everything else was standing on a rooftop with the person he loved, and nothing in the world had ever been enough to move him from where he chose to stand. Izuku Midoriya breathed out, and the city was still there, and the stars were still there, and Momo's hand was warm in his, and the bone armor that covered his body was proof of every fire he'd walked through, and the light beneath his skin was proof of every time he'd been reduced to nothing and rebuilt himself into more. And he knew, with the certainty of someone who had tested it against death itself, that this was enough, that he was enough, that the wall he'd built between the people he loved and the darkness that hunted them would hold for as long as his heart kept beating, and his heart would keep beating for as long as there was something worth protecting on the other side.
The Hero Roster. A massive salute to the legends backing this journey. Your support is what keeps the momentum at an all-time high and the dream moving forward. You guys are the absolute best. Crow heroes, the elite front line, stepping up and setting the pace for the whole community. DA Fire 05.
Symbol of peace. The pillars of the community, the titans who keep our foundations solid and the hype at an all-time high. Alexander Igarza, That Guy Miso, Deck, Lydell Scott Jr., James Martin, Victor Laroux, Rune Brokstad, Ariuse Bryant, Jonah Wheeler, T-Mac, XXHJRX3A7XX, Hyperbeams, Michael Murphy, Grand Region Kell, Sin Hunter, Logan Bland, Alexander Johannes, Alex Morgan, Ray Various, That Other Guy Too, Chad Reynolds, T. Mackie 68 Rimuru, A. Zetros, Dweller of the Deepest Depths, Lone Wolf, Jacob Ropes, Bully Maguire Shadow, Rathakit Thitiratnan Fakul, Neostar Productions, Asael Cardenas, Shaquan Simmons, Thunder, Sunawin 631, Elijah Saunders, Peter Hamilton, Freddie Rose, Omega, Akuma Noakami, Remorsefuls, Black Vein, Joshua Hedrington, Aaron Abercrombie, Drift SK8ER, Corey Tokars, Jan, Devin Black, Crow, Joe Bros, Ray Von Crimson River, Dante Alastor, Adam Yonkers, Blood Saints, Donna Cafe, Zeph, KC, Howie 60, Ignacio. Hope of the universe, the ultimate guardians, celestial tier supporters whose impact literally shines across the galaxy. Void Rot, Chaos Umbre, Noroi Uzumaki Uchiha, Tyshawn Palmer, Coldbane 4, The Maniac 563, Debs, LS Morningstar, Marl, Spintown, I Shoot X50, Greg Green, James, Q Hon Yen Thompson, Juan, and Zeno KJ. Thanks for watching this full Deku story. If you enjoyed the intense action, epic adaptations, and heartfelt moments, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more powerful My Hero Academia What If tales. Drop a comment with your favorite part. See you in the next one.